Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. I'm trying to make my own remarks relatively brief, although I have been invited to set the context here. And in the typical fashion, as one of my students said of the Academy Awards, let me get the thank yous in first. To the organizers, the Center for Intellectual Property Policy and the Schulich School of Music, and the Faculty of Law of CIPP, my colleague, Dean Nicholas Kassir, many thanks. To the people who actually do these things, Mary Beth Campbell in my office, Lisa Henry in the CIPP, many thanks to them and all the folks who work with them. My colleagues, Professors Dave Lametti and Tina Piper of CIPP, Dave Lank of the Dobson Center for Entrepreneurial Studies, and Peter Todd, Dean of the Des Hotels Faculty of Management, who are helping us with a course that we're running right now. Also, Professor Bruce Menorgan, Associate Dean here, and Sandy Perlman, our distinguished visiting scholar and the first Dean's Chair in music by Seymour Schulich's gift. The course we are giving in the management faculty is called variously the Treble Cliff, that is Dave Lank's connotation, or Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control, the remonetization of music and other promiscuously transportable media objects. The course is rather innovative. It gathers students from music, management, law, computer science, and communications, and some of them are here today. I'd also like to thank our sponsors for today's event, McCarthy Tetro and MBM Intellectual Property Law, and again, Seymour Schulich, for whom, in addition to his rather visionary gift in the Canadian context of $20 million to music and higher education, also provided me with some modest seed money for just this kind of insanity. This past fall, I was a keynote speaker at a session of the Association of European Conservatories, where I felt a bit like the alchemical fourth of three. There was a festival program director, an artist management agent, a recording company executive, and myself. We had an occasion to talk about the role and position of music in society, the so-called devaluation of music and the revaluation of music. For musicians, the devaluation of music centers on two things. One of them is the deteriorating sound quality in today's musical environment. The other is the changing expectations of return to artists, including musicians, in the monetary scheme that exists today. The revaluation of music deals with the rapid change in the global socioeconomic and cultural conditions in terms of changing technologies and the attendant mobility of people and ideas. Also, there's a very interesting reaffirmation of amateurism and a rebroadening of the participatory base of art expression. There are impediments today and challenges to face in the future. Now we move to today's discussion, musical myopia. Musicians find themselves often unable to respond to new opportunities today without harboring secret hope of success in outmoded ways of success, namely the stardom model of the past. The music industry has its own myopia. It's unable to see beyond its dwindling, sometimes disastrously dwindling pocketbook, to embrace new monetization models, and to reaffirm its commitment to artists and to the art form. Digital dystopia? I thought it was digital utopia, you say. More music to more people at less cost. Economic and legal superstructures, however, are unable to respond to these new opportunities with sufficient nimbleness and with consciousness of our changed realities. It seems you can't teach an old law new tricks. Music has always been mediated by technology. I have occasion every other year to introduce the Organ Academy here. And I remind the organists, we're a little fearful of all the technological goings-on in this building, that they themselves were the leading technological form of the day in Bach's time. The organ was the most advanced technological tool of its time. Our challenge today, however, is that we have a lot of bad technology. We have poor sampling rates in CD technology, compressed sound in MP3 and other formats, and we also have DRM, digital rights management, various types of protection of technology. We've moved to a modular and digital world from an analog continuum, and we've suffered many of the attendant consequences. For musicians today, critical reflective thinking becomes crucial. They have to find ways to achieve their own marketable uniqueness, a kind of specialization, an era where niche goes global, and where one of the great opportunities of the new age can be grabbed. For conservatories, this means we have to rise above our name. We have to reimagine. We have to take conservation as innovation. And we have to abandon the romantic individualism which aspires to solo singularities in an extreme pyramid model, and also abandon, until recently, the dominant European industrial socialist model of players graduating from conservatories as cogs in a state-funded orchestral wheel. We have an opportunity to reaffirm our mission for the training and education of highly qualified personnel, not just for the music business or the music industry, but for music itself on a global scale. This is not naivety or hopeful prayer, but a call to action to develop creative, flexible musician leaders. What do they do? What do? We train the emotions. This is very uncomfortable for many people, but through music, we express our deepest feelings, aspirations, and hopes for shared reality and shared collectivity. We have to put together today's events to provide a forum for discussion of the current situation in digital rights. The Schulich School of Music has a leadership position in professional training of creative and performing musicians, in humanities-based research in music, and scientific technological research in music, particularly through CERMIT, our Center for Interdisciplinary Research in Music, Media, and Technology. We welcome this partnership with CIPP and McGill's renowned Faculty of Law, with its unique feature of common and civil law in parallel. This past fall, the Future of Music Coalition met here. Many of you were at that event for the first time outside the US. As a participant and sometimes panelist in these events, I'm often disappointed with what I refer to as the serial killing aspect of the panel format. Too many panelists with too mixed expertise, too little time for discussion. Today's gathering attempts to obviate that condition by providing more time for the panelists individually and collectively to engage each other and the audience. In particular, the response session this morning and the discussion forum this afternoon are opportunities for interaction that just don't happen enough. And let me say at this point that you have in your folders a question sheet, and we would ask you after this first session, but certainly before the break, to fill out the question sheet with questions you may have for this afternoon's forum. We'd like to be able to gather those before the lunch period so that we can be better prepared for this afternoon. So, on a personal note, let me just say that the ubiquitous and often highly misleading references to DRM, digital rights management, as in DRM is a problem, should Canada adopt DRM, DRM abuse continues, and Steve Jobs, somewhat disingenuously courting record labels to get rid of DRM. He's willing to do it if they are. Now, you have to understand, my name is Don McLean, and for reasons no one ever figured out entirely, my parents gave me the middle name Roderick. Thus, my initials are DRM. And it's frankly a little disconcerting to have your initials up in lights with Steve Jobs suggesting you might be gotten rid of. But on that quixotic note, let's get rid of this DRM and turn the day over to Dave Lametti and our first exceptionally distinguished panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Don, for setting really the tone for the two panel discussions that we are going to have this morning and the open discussion that we are going to undertake in the law faculty this afternoon. This first panel is rather eclectic. You have the biographies with you, so I will only introduce them, if you will, with my own spin. Bruce Lehman from the International Intellectual Property Institute, a nonprofit, non-governmental organization which he founded after a career in public service. And if I could describe Bruce Lehman in one phrase, it would be IP's public servant. And he's going to, I think, continue in that role today. And Ann Chaidovitz, just to Bruce's left, to my right, is an attorney now with the U.S. Patent and Trade Office, so handling bilateral and multilateral negotiations on the part of the American government, after having had a long career in private practice working for composers and authors in the practice of copyright law. And if I could describe Anne in one phrase, it would be IP's public practitioner. On my immediate left, Michael Geist, who is a professor of law at the CRC, chair in Internet and E-commerce law at the University of Ottawa, author of numerous academic articles, well-known blogger, and I think if I could describe Michael in one phrase, it would be Canada's public intellectual with respect to IP, and that role has become more and more international. Finally, Terry Fisher from Harvard University, again, well-known author covering subjects from the philosophy of intellectual property to the future of the entertainment industry. And if I had to describe Terry in one sentence, I guess it would be IP's public philosopher. We do indeed have promises to keep today with respect to our discussions, and I mean this both literally and metaphorically, but we do also have miles to go before we sleep. So without any further ado, we'll begin with Bruce Lehman.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you very much for having me up here in Montreal. I always like coming to Canada. I feel it's an escape from the sort of political struggle that takes place in the United States that is sometimes very depressing. You know, this is a very, Canada's always been such a humane, even-tempered country, and it's always a pleasure to be here. And that's certainly reflected in the introductions. My purpose here this morning, I think, is to put the DRM debate in perspective as it relates to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act and the policies that were developed in the United States during the 1990s by the Clinton administration, where I served as Assistant Secretary of Commerce, it's now Undersecretary of Commerce, and Commissioner of Patents and Trademarks, and we had responsibility for developing the intellectual property policies of the United States and its international diplomacy regarding intellectual property too, which which led to the current WIPO copyright treaty and the Performers and Phonograms Treaty. And our Digital Millennium Copyright Act is really an iteration of, in domestic law, of the requirements of those treaties. And of course, Canada is still contemplating what to do about that. And now Canada has the experience, the benefit of, soon to be a decade of experience of the U.S. In attempting to manage these policies. I want to start out by saying, what the objectives and the philosophy were behind our policy initiatives back in the 1990s. First, the Clinton administration, and it's now, pretty ancient history, but when President Clinton ran for office, he, part of his campaign theme was that he would, and this was really before the internet, it's hard to believe, he actually campaigned using the expression, the electronic superhighway, and he was one of the things that he saw as a vision for the U.S. economy is that we would capture the economic benefits of the emerging electronic superhighway. And the economic architecture of the Clinton administration was based on the notion that the future of the United States would depend upon high-wage, high-tech jobs that would come out of the various technology industries, but also an important part of technology industries was the, quote, information industry or industries, and of course that encompasses even the more traditional cultural industries because they're a part of the information industry. This economic architecture informed all of our policies, beginning with lowering, balancing our federal budget so that we would unleash more investment capital by lowering interest rates to invest in these new industries, and it informed our trade policy whereby we were willing to open up our domestic markets to inexpensive manufactured products from other countries in return for the capacity to export more high technology properties, and of course these would have to be protected by strong intellectual property laws, and that's why important part of the architecture of the WTO treaty is this TRIPS agreement, which is supposed to provide very strong protection for intellectual property rights. That was the overall architecture. And we had all kinds of task forces and working groups and so on and so forth. And we had a working group on, in terms of the electronic superhighway, that quickly got turned into something a lot less jazzy sounding. And that was the National Information Infrastructure Task Force, and chaired by Ron Brown, the Secretary of Commerce. And I was then the head of the Intellectual Property Working Group. And we produced a 250-some white-page white paper. And at the end of that white paper, you will find the first draft of what became the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And as we considered this matter back then, we felt that basically it would be extremely difficult for copy control. And basically copyright, I mean, one of the fundamental exclusive rights of a copyright owner under all of the copyright laws of the world is the exclusive right to make copies and to license other people to make copies. I mean, that's just always been the law. And so how do you do that in this, I mean, in the old days when the only way you could make copies was by setting up a printing press and virtually having a factory, it was pretty easy to control that right. But in a digital environment where anybody around the world can make a copy of something, it's pretty hard. So we concluded that the only way to keep that right going in the emerging digital age would be to introduce into the copyright law the notion, and this has been very controversial and still is to this day, of course, the notion that that the copyright owner would have to use technology to protect themselves. And we envisioned that, and we were prepared to give rights holders rights under the copyright law to protect themselves when they use such technology. And so we introduced this notion of an anti-circumvention right. That is, we assumed that they would encrypt and use other methods to restrict distribution of their product in digital format, but that, and we wanted to prevent other people from just going out and knowingly and willingly trying to defeat that activity. Not inadvertently, but people who really wanted to try to unlock the box. And by the way, that doesn't mean that people can't give away things for free. I mean, and that's historically been true in copyright. We have all kinds of publications and so on and so forth that have been distributed for no money or very little money. We have everything from, magazines and newspapers that are distributed free and based on an advertising business model, all the way to Wall Street newsletters that charge $100,000 a subscription per year for maybe, a very small number of subscribers. So, so there are a lot of different models, and we just wanted to permit those to go forward. Well, we're now, a decade into that, and I have to say, and I have taken so much heat, you can't believe it, been called all kinds of names and everything else. I just wish, I remember there was a article that was written about me by a New York Times, by a fellow named Ticini, who's famous because he sued the New York Times, and there's a big case named after him, and he wrote it, and if you Google me, it used to be if you Googled me, you would see this article by Jonathan Ticini saying that Bruce Lehman, you don't know who Bruce Lehman is, but when he's done with the Clinton administration, he's going to be running around in limousines and a millionaire and everything else because just a tool of Hollywood. Well, here I am. I have my not-for-profit institute. I'm of counsel in a law firm. I just wish. But I have to say, don't ask for gratitude. Hollywood does not have a big heart. It's a cold place. And with a short memory. Nevertheless, we were not about, it wasn't about, my future. It was about trying to create an economic policy that would be good for my country and hopefully others too in the world to have an economy that wasn't just based on, breaking physical labor, but on trying to create an economy based on the fruits of the mind. Well, where are we? Unfortunately, at least in some areas, our policies haven't worked out too well, and that's not for want of trying. And just this last week, I've been traveling around the U.S. this last week and, reading our national press, and Wall Street Journal's had 2 articles, front page articles in the last week, and one of them on Wednesday was front page piece, and it's sales of music long in decline plunge sharply, and it's a long article, and says the music industry has been banking on the rise of digital music to compensate for the inevitable drops in sales of CDs, talks about iTunes, etc. It hasn't worked so far. That way, at least so far, digital sales of individual songs this year have risen 54%, but that's nowhere near enough to offset the 20% decline in CD sales. And it points out that, a lot of the problem is, unauthorized MP3 copying and so on and so forth. I think, the cat's out of the bag, basically. And it also talks about how, one of the business models is selling T-shirts. I remember we used to hear that back, in the Clinton administration. Well, artists should sell T-shirts. Well, apparently that's what they're doing. I had a discussion. I was in New York a few weeks ago and talking with a lawyer who works with my institute. He recently went over to Africa and gave some lectures in a program that we put on there. And he is a lawyer in New York that represents recording artists, and he specializes in Latin music genres. And he was telling me that now when he does deals with record labels, it used to be in the old days that your concert revenue and so on, that was completely yours. The labels never went after that. Now, when they do a deal with you, they want a share of your concert revenue, for example. Why? Because that's where the money is. It's because they're not making money off the classical sales of sound recordings anymore. So we clearly are developing a new economic model because our attempts at copyright control, at least thus far, have not been successful. And so I am sorry to say, but I think at least with regard to music, I believe that we are in, if not entering, the post-copyright era. And I hate to say that because I think copyright was a great model for compensating artists, but I really think that we are now in the post-copyright era. We've had great creations in the pre-copyright era. Some of the greatest music ever created in the history of human beings was created in the pre-copyright era in the 18th century when we had a model that basically was based on the patronage of the European nobility. But the artist wasn't very valued then. One of the best plays I ever saw on Broadway was the play about Mozart and Salieri, Amadeus. And if you see that play, that really, here you have one of the greatest musicians ever to walk the face of this planet. And he's just plotting and scheming and begging to become, I think a court Kapellmeister or something like that in the imperial court in Vienna. And of course, Salieri is, trying to stop him and everything else. In other words, he couldn't really make, in that play, interestingly, he does make some money. He gets in such bad shape, he has to go out and rent a theater in Vienna and put on a play, and he makes some money from ticket revenues and so on and so forth. But he's really just burdened down by the bureaucracy of the imperial court. Well, we're going back to that era. I think that in the absence of copyright, basically there will be a new form of patronage, and those will be the industries that require music for their business. And of course, the state will continue to play a role, and it may have to play a bigger role to the extent of providing non-industrial music, through state subsidies and so on. But I think we're going to a period where, obviously, broadcast networks and webcasters and everything, they're all going to have music. They're going to want to, XM radio and Sirius and so on in the U.S., they're going to have product, and so they can commission it to be made, just like the nobles of Europe who wanted to have somebody playing, music in their salons were able to do so. But I'm afraid that's where we're going, and we're going that way because people have lost respect for the copyright law. And finally, I don't just blame teenagers and college students. I really blame the moguls in the music industry, because had they been thinking about these business models when we were doing our work in 1994 in the Clinton administration, had they been developing effective online distribution models when the internet first came into business, had they been talking to Steve Case when AOL first started to become a big deal, and really seriously developing an online business model, perhaps we would not be in the situation that we are. But the culture of that industry was such that, those people were concerned principally with, and their talents were developing talent, understanding public taste. They didn't know anything about distribution or technology or anything like that. Minions dealt with that. Well, their industry has paid the price, and I think that when you saw the final straw was when Time Warner, Jerry Parsons, the chief executive of Time Warner, in quite a shock to me, early on in this crisis, divested his company of the largest music company on the planet, and the most successful, which was still very profitable, and including the publishing division, which really surprised me, which, by the way, I think is an exception to this. I think music publishing and the exploitation of the performance right and so on still is a potentially very lucrative business. But he gave it all up. Warner Chappell Music was over $1 billion business. He just let it go, and he fortunately found a person of Canadian descent with a lot of money, who loved being an impresario in the rock business, to buy it from him. And his competitors, many of them are still out there looking for buyers for their music divisions. So I think that was the Wall Street judgment, basically, on where the business goes. And so I don't want to be, hopefully there's not any, I won't be quoted in the U.S., but I'm afraid our Clinton administration policies didn't work out very well.
Thank you very much, Bruce. We have a bit of time flexibility. If I could probably take one question at this point for Bruce Lehman. If not, I'll move right to Ann Scheidewitz. Isolde.
Can you envision a copyright legislation or policy that would distinguish between musical work and other kinds of works?
Well, yes, I can envision it. Of course, that creates a lot of legal problems under international treaties and so on and so forth. It's very difficult to discriminate against different forms of intellectual property. So that would be hard to do. I don't know that would make any difference. I mean, I'm not sure I don't really think there's any difference much between the other forms of intellectual property and music. I think that, I don't think there's any difference between audiovisual works, for example, motion pictures, and music. The primary difference is just that movie studios, for example, did not put out in digital format, in unencrypted form, their entire catalogs of works prior to this internet revolution, as did the music industry. you know, the music is already out there. It was there to be accessed by MP3 technology and so on and so forth. So these other industries have the advantage, one of being able to use technology more effectively to control the exploitation of their works, because they haven't let the cat out of the bag. And then two, obviously, even to this day, there's still you know, people who want to engage in copying, unauthorized or otherwise, are constrained by bandwidth and so on and so forth. I mean, I was thinking the other day of maybe downloading a movie, you know, legitimately, and God, it takes an hour, even with high-speed internet, to, you know, download a file for maybe longer for a whole movie, and that's just not worth the hassle, you know. That's completely different with the song. Now, you know, I think one of the interesting questions is, going forward, I think that the cinematographic community certainly does have challenges. I think they're more on top of it. As I said, the record people just were completely out of it. They totally missed the boat. They did not develop their business models. I think the story may be different with regard to audiovisual, with regard to audiovisual works, but it's still a bit of an open question. And then there's a sort of separate question of computer programs and so on, but they're vended in an entirely different manner.
Thank you. Turn the floor over to Anne Chaidowitz.
Well, I want to thank you all for having me here today to speak. And I'd like to, at the beginning, say one correction. I work at the Patent and Trademark Office. The trade office is very territorial. I don't do trade, so they can't get mad at me. Anyhow, and I hate to do this, but I'm going to have to disagree with my esteemed colleague here. I think we're not moving into a post-copyright era. We're moving into a changed business model era, but it's still going to revolve, I think, survive on copyright. And the articles that he pointed out about the decrease in sales and digital sales not making up for it, well, that's no new business model. The new business model's not really there yet. A digital sale is still a sale. You know, at the end, he mentioned that the performance right and the publishing will still continue to exist. Well, those are copyright rights, and those will be lucrative. That is the continuation of copyright. What's going to happen is the business models are all going to change. You know, we're entering the technology has put us in a period of disruption. This is normal when there are changes like this. When radio first came out, sales decreased more than they have now. As you all know, you know, radio and sales ended up working quite well together. They developed new relationships, and at the end, radio actually often contributed to sales. So we're just going through a change, and there are going to be new business models. There have to be, and we have to work through the change. And I do think that the DMCA has provided the necessary tools to work through the change. It's working well in that there are all kinds of new models that are just starting. Granted, you know, they probably should have been started in '94, at least thought about in '94. They weren't, but there are new business models being thought about now. And the lockup that people were feared, that the law would, you know, prohibit non-infringing uses, really hasn't occurred. You know, we have, the law provides for a triennial rulemaking to see whether there are any particular classes of copyrighted works that need to be exempted from the protection of circumvention of access controls to such works. Excuse me. And these rulemakings give us the chance to monitor the developments in the marketplace and to determine whether the copyright owners are using the protections that the DMCA offers them in ways that diminish the ability of individuals to work in lawful non-infringing uses. And we've just completed our third rulemaking, and the rulemaking showed that the law is working quite well and is not limiting non-infringing uses of work. In this last rulemaking, there were 6 narrow classes of exemptions where they said, oh yeah, here there is a problem with your ability to use non-infringing uses. So, and in the past, I think there'd only been 3. So it is working, I think, quite well. I think we need to talk about TPMs, some background, that there are really 2 kinds of TPMs we're talking about, TPMs, DRMs, digital rights management. The first are measures that a copyright owner uses to protect their copyrights. So they limit the number of times you can reproduce it or burn it or take it, something like that. The second is a technological protection measure that permits access to the work. So that's much more like the admission fee you pay to go into a movie theater. You're in the movie theater, you're watching the movie. If you sneak into the movie theater, you're not infringing the movie by watching it, but you've violated the access control. So there are 2 different kinds of TPMs that we are contemplating: the rights control TPM and the access control TPM. Now, the U.S. law, just so you know, only prohibits circumvention of the access control TPM. The rights control TPM, if you circumvent it, you could be infringing the copyright. And I think it is working, and the best place for these new business models to develop. It provides a good playing field, because the free market is the best place, to develop the new business models. I don't care how smart your government is, how smart your academics are, and they can come up with great business models in their mind, but the best way to develop a business model is the free market. And we've seen that once copyright owners have these technological protection measures, or the protection of technological protection measures if they use it, they have begun to experiment with new business models. And now it's the marketplace saying, well, consumers like this, consumers don't like this. It's a development. And specifically, I think, in the U.S., and I can talk as a consumer, the protection that's provided for circumvention and access technological protection measures has provided all these great services. Now, if you go online, before, some of you probably buy movies. I don't want to buy a movie. What a waste of money to spend, however much to buy a movie that I'm going to watch one time. I want to watch a movie. Now, before there were technological protection measures, before they were protected, the studios, they wouldn't let you just watch a movie. They wouldn't even rent them until they came out with some technological protection measures, so they knew it wouldn't be copied. I'm much happier paying a whole lot less to rent a movie and return it. Now, when you move it into the digital world, rather than paying all or nothing, you can pay a smaller amount to stream a movie. You can pay a little more than streaming to download a movie, and it'll sit on your computer, but from when you start to watch it, you'll have 24 hours from when you click on it before it disappears, which is great for me. If I'm going on an airplane, I can download a movie to my computer and watch it, when I'm flying. And then it'll go away. But I'm paying much less. So it's enabled all these flexibilities. Then you can pay a little bit more if you want to download it to your computer and keep it on your computer. You can pay a little bit more or a lot more, I guess, if you want to download it and be able to burn it and bring it to other disks. So the ability to use these access protection measures and to have them protected has enabled the development of a lot of new business models that benefit the content owner, the new businesses, and the consumer, because it's no longer an all or nothing. I mean, digital technology is letting you only pay for the use that you want. And as we were talking about before, This is a huge time of change and disruption. The revenue streams, the sales revenue stream is going down. At the end of the day, though, I think the overall pot of revenues will be bigger. Traditional sales may be different, less, but I think the music industry, the recorded music industry, will be more like the music publishing industry with a lot of varied revenue streams, and you're starting to see that. Then, of course, these new business models might need some changes in the law. These changes are separate and apart and even primarily, mostly unrelated to the DMCA, but because there are new ways now that music is being provided and consumed. I don't know, last year in the US there were 2 new bills being introduced. One was all the recording industry, the music publishers, and the digital music services all got together and said, the statutory license for reproduction and distribution, publishing license that we have now, doesn't work in these new business models. If you want to use the license the way it is now, you have to go song by song. Now these services are trying to clear 100,000 songs at a time. Doesn't work. And so there may need to be changes to the law. Most of these are almost all totally unrelated to the protections that were provided by the DMCA, but new business models could need changes. I was at there's a bill introduced last year called Perform, which was to ensure platform equity among all the new platforms through which music is delivered. It may have already been introduced this year, I'm not sure. But last week I was at a luncheon and a congressional staffer was talking. And one of the things she said is, look, senator I work for was saying, when you're in your car, you can listen to your music on the iPod, and plug it in. You can listen to it through a CD. You can listen to it on the radio. You can listen to it on satellite radio. Right now, all of those are paid differently. And that's just, to enable new models to thrive, there should be some kind of platform equity, her boss believed. And now what I think is really important to enable these new businesses, and often gets lost in the conversation, is the laws don't require the use of DRMs or technological protection measures. They require respect for those if the owner decides to use them. So, and the owners, now that they're protected, are trying things and seeing what the free market will permit. A lot of copyrighted works are out in MP3 format on a service. They're out with a DRM on one service. They're out with a different DRM on another service. They're out in all kinds of ways. They can be out on like an e-music service where they're out in MP3 format, so there's no rights DRM, but there's an access DRM because you have to pay your fee to e-music. So there still is an access DRM, even though the music is put out there in an MP3 format. So, it's providing all these unique alternatives, and the new business models are beginning to develop. One really clever thing, I think, that the law did that's helped its enforcement is that it prohibited the manufacture and sale of devices that can be used, that are primarily used to circumvent protections. Because most acts of circumvention occur in the privacy of the home, and most individuals don't have the computer savvy to create their own measures without the assistance of a device. So prohibition of the devices is critical, and prohibition of the manufacture and distribution in devices yields more effective and less intrusive enforcement, because it lessens the need to implement by seeing what you're doing in your house. Are you circumventing? So they can just go to the store and get rid of all the devices. They don't have to see what you're doing in your house. So it's much less intrusive, and I think that has worked quite well. One other thing that people often confuse is because you're using a DRM, that doesn't mean it has to be non-interoperable. People often get confusion. People complain about the Apple DRM. Most of the complaints I've heard about the Apple DRM don't have anything to do with how many times you can copy, the rights requirements. They have to do with the fact that you can't use it on a different device, that it's not interoperable with, different services. And that's not a function of the DRM. It's a function of the DRM. It's not a function of the rights requirement. It's a function that Apple doesn't license their DRM technology to other people. And I think that, when Apple first started, first you can just see the free market working as the Apple DRMs, demonstrate. First, the record labels wanted to lock things down so tight nobody wanted them. So DRMs weren't working. Then, Steve Jobs comes along. He's got enough power. He says, this is what I'm going to do. And people like it because there is a DRM, but it's not a DRM that people normally will come across because you're not going to copy 8 times unless you're trying to do something wrong. So people accept it. Then there's a proliferation of other kinds of devices and services, and people are also seeing, but there's no interoperability. So now there's a problem that consumers are concerned about with interoperability, and I think the marketplace is actually starting to deal with that and you see labels now talking about maybe for sales, they won't put a DRM on it. There's some releases to test how the water is. So this is the free market actually playing out. I have 5 minutes? Okay. A few other really good things, I think, that have about the DMCA. One is we have in the DMCA something called notice and takedown. And what that has done is it's enabled new technologies to develop while also protecting copyrighted material at the same time. The purpose of the law is to encourage the internet service providers, the ISPs, to cooperate in stopping infringement by limiting the liability that they have if they do. So, for example, to take advantage of this liability limitation, a web hoster, if they get a notice, let's say, I'm a copyright owner, I send them a notice, I own the copyright in this song, they have to take it down. And that way, they're shielded from liability. Of course, if they also send it to the person who posted it and say, so-and-so says they own this song, I'm taking it down. If that person says, oh, no, they don't own it, they have to put it back up. They're still shielded from liability by doing that. So it goes back up, and then it only goes down if the original person who claimed to be the copyright owner files a lawsuit. And what this has done is it's resulted in probably, I'm guessing at the number, but I'm sure it's millions by now, of takedowns. So copyrighted work has taken millions of copyrighted works protected down from unauthorized postings. It has, there's been no litigation then. There's been, no need for the government to get involved in enforcing. It's created this really effective, private enforcement mechanism that doesn't even need litigation. So it's worked quite well. And then one last thing that I was thinking of when we were talking about the introduction is, digital technology is creating a lot of challenges. It's not just DRMs, TPM. I mean, look at the challenges that are created by sampling. This is all just because of digital new technologies. There are, creators whose works are being used, they're without permission or not being paid, and this is just a new challenge, but I think it will be addressed as every new challenge has been in the past.
Thank you, Anne. I think the issue is now joined. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act is on the table. We've heard comments both for and against, or at least assessments for and against. I suspect we'll hear more, and I suspect we'll hear more in the Canadian context, turning the floor over to Michael Geist.
Sorry, just give me a second.
In the meantime, I'll take your question. Sure.
No, no, there are, it doesn't prevent circumvention of copy-controlled DRMs. It only prevents circumvention of access-controlled DRMs. And then there are a number of specific exceptions. Law enforcement, research, interoperability. There are 8 to 10 exceptions. I have them all written down there. I don't know them off the top of my head. But there are specific exceptions. Law enforcement.
Because the way I understand the DMCA is a specific protection for the DRMs. So let's say somebody invents a new mousetrap, that's it. There's going to be other people who are going to inspect it, try to find new ways to make it better and things like that. But the way I understand the DRM, the DMCA, there was, I think, a lot of litigation against people who are trying to, let's say, study some specific DRMs from some.
Well, there was that famous case, but that, you know, they withdrew that. That never.
Yeah, I think that there are numerous specific exemptions that permit you to do that. Other than that, too, that's the access control. And since there is no, prohibition against the rights circumvention, if you have a copyright, if it's fair use or whatever, you're allowed to do it. As to the access control TPMs, there are numerous specific exemptions, plus there is that 3-year catch-all, so that the triennial rulemaking, so if there is a TPM being used that you believe that a class of works believes is infringing or is prohibiting their ability to make non-infringing uses of the work, they can go to the Copyright Office and get a ruling.
There was a famous case that I think you're referring to. I think it was brought against a Princeton professor who was doing some work, and they, yeah, and that case was withdrawn. Obviously, it was never litigated. It was clearly inappropriate to bring that. I certainly would never propose that. I just want to point out that when you talk about the mousetrap, that would be covered under the patent law in the United States, and we have no reason, and the patent law is a much, much more powerful right than the copyright, because the patent right includes the right to control the use, exclude others from using the work, and we have no research exemption in our United States patent law. So literally, the right to use a product for research is an exclusive right of the patent owner. So.
And in the most recent rulemaking, and this wasn't the Ed Felton case, but I think it was brought on perhaps by, I don't know who filed it, but it's probably Ed Felton or the EFF. After the Sony BMG rootkit, there was an exception that you can circumvent that if you're trying to check for security and make sure there's no flaws. So that's why we say there is this 3-year catch-all system that actually works when new situations come up.
Thank you. I suspect that Michael Geist, patiently awaiting, will have more to say on all of this. Thank you. Michael.
Thanks, David. And thanks so much to the organizers, particularly Sandy Perlman, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to participate on this panel. So as you might have guessed, and as the title suggests, I'm going to provide the Canadian case, I think, against anti-circumvention legislation. And I want to start by looking back, I guess, about 10 years ago, so slightly after Bruce Lehman's talked about 93 or so as the starting point. I'm going to look back to 97, so about 10 years ago, a time when the internet looked something like this. This was Netscape Navigator, actually back in 95. It's right around that same time. This is what the CBC looked like back at that time. This was the front page for Yahoo, which has changed pretty dramatically. And Google looked something like this. It was just a Stanford research project at that point in time. That's what things looked like back then. And of course, out of that environment, out of the understanding of what the internet looked like and projections within that context of how technology might evolve, we got the WIPO Copyright Treaty and WPP treaties. Now fast forward to where we are today, and I think this is a room where people of course recognize the kinds of things that are happening. But in 2007, we today of course live in a world where there are about 70 million blogs out there, some worth reading, lots perhaps not, but an amazing amount of participation and expression taking place. A world in which seemingly all college students and certainly all musicians have a space on MySpace, and particularly in the music world, an opportunity to find new fans and find ways to distribute their music. Of course, it's not just in the music space, the podcast world. I was asking earlier, this is being webcast, but is this being podcast as well? Because of course, today there are thousands upon thousands of people who are taking advantage of these new technologies to podcast out their content. There are thousands of people who are taking advantage of simple sites like this, Post Secret, which allows people each week, every Sunday, posting a series of new secrets that one might not be comfortable telling your family or your friends, but you tell the rest of the world. Last year they received about 250,000 of these mashups. It's one of the most popular blogs online. Many of them, frankly, are rather sad. It's people who are struggling with drug addiction or failed relationships and the like. A lot are not. It's been the subject of now 2 best-selling books and has appeared in art galleries throughout the United States. We live in a world where there are movies like this one, Star Wreck, a Finnish film that took 7 years to make. It's available as a free download. You can also purchase, if you like, the DVD and an assortment of t-shirts. It turns out they've actually made back all their money that it cost to make this film in the first place, based on those sales, while giving away the movie and actually selling some of the rights to rebroadcast the film. It's quite good. To some television networks. There's movies like Elephant's Dream, billed as the world's first open movie, open not just because they've made it freely available, but also because the tools that were used to create Elephant's Dream is open source software, Blender in this case. So free tools to create the movie, and a movie that's then made freely available. There is, of course, YouTube, which, the Lonely Girl story from the summer, which of course much of the discussion revolved around whether or not this was an amateur production, as it were, or a professional production. I actually found it much more interesting that it turned out it was a professional production, because it suggests that this is a whole different way of distributing television programming, shorter programming, 2 minutes at a time. There have been lots and lots and lots of these Lonely Girl episodes, and the ratings, in a sense, the number of downloads, would make many cable operators cry in shame, because it outranks many of those kinds of programs. There's, of course, what's taking place in 2007 with our public broadcasters, the BBC, taking many of their clips, hundreds of hours increasingly of their content, and making it available to the public who has paid for it to reuse. 200 million Flickr photographs and counting, 20 million of which are under Creative Commons licenses, where people are inviting them to rework, to take that work and use it, particularly in non-commercial ways. There is, of course, Creative Commons, established by Larry Lessig a number of years ago. More than 160 million works now CC licensed, including increasingly mainstream work that's adopting CC licenses. There's Wikipedia with its now millions of articles. People around the world contributing user-generated content. In a sense, the 19,000, this slide is out of date, the 19,000 books that are in the public domain made available through Project Gutenberg, the increasing growing number of journals available under open access through the Public Library of Science, and now many others, including increasingly many funding agencies that are mandating that those that get taxpayer dollars for their research ensure that that work is made available to the public. There's the MIT Courseware Initiative in 2007, which 6 years ago set as its objective to, within a decade, within 10 years, make all their content from their various courses available. They're going to have that done this year, 4 years ahead of schedule. And then, of course, underlying so much of this is open source software. This is what
I used to create my own website. And then, of course, we live in an era where Time magazine brings all of this together and says, we're all the person of the year. So this is the internet in 2007, a very different one from internet in 1997 at a time when we were signing and thinking about the DMCA and the WIPO copyright treaties. And so with the greatest respect, I say to those that were involved in that process, they guessed wrong. Okay, the vision of a world in which we would take content and consume it and so needed to control it simply isn't the world that has unfolded. The reality is that it isn't this guy that has been most responsible for the kinds of developments in signing the DMCA, it's these guys. It's Sean Fanning from a music space that finally got the music industry to move forward and start offering, albeit as we've heard not very successfully, online services. And it is Chad Hurley and Steve Chen in the music space who with YouTube have propelled the broadcasters and others to begin to offer their content online as well. It is a world in which, while it was once these groups, the CREAs and the Access Copyrights of the world who said, we're the ones who are participating in this discussion, now must make way for others who want to participate as well, musicians, artists, and others who come forward with a very different vision from the one that was articulated in 1997. It is indeed a very different world. That doesn't quite make the case for anti-circumvention legislation, so let me spend a few minutes trying to do that. It really highlights just how much things have changed. Now, I think there's a number of reasons why, and some of them started with the question that we got just before I started talking. I think we've seen, frankly, that anti-circumvention can be harmful. Now, the Sony BMG rootkit case is a great case. I find it, frankly, rather astonishing to say, well, we can solve this issue as long as you get yourself into the queue for that 3-year annual review. In other words, you consumers, it's okay, we will every 3 years ensure that your computers might be protected because we can identify a particular issue that someone has to show, that someone might not be able to identify whether or not there is a security risk associated with some of the DRMs that are out there. We're talking about an incident that affected not just hundreds of thousands of consumers, but the artists themselves, who of course saw sales plummet, not just those that were directly affected by the rootkit, but many others. As the reality is, the choice that is made by those who use DRM often has an implication for those that choose not to use DRM. As artists suddenly find their fans asking, what is going to happen when I buy this CD and I put it in my computer, even if it contains nothing whatsoever? Now, the DMCA experience that we heard from Anne is working very well. I might well beg to differ. The Ed Felton slide, that's Ed Felton up there. The thing that's most interesting about Ed Felton, frankly, the thing that's most interesting about almost all these stories, these are all various DMCA-like stories that often get brought out, are not the part that people know about, it's the part that people don't know about. So Bruce mentioned that in the Felton case, there was a prospect that he was going to be sued when, together with some graduate students, they identified a way to break the encryption on SDMI. Here's the other part of the story that I think is more interesting. Literally a year ago, last March, I was on a conference panel with Professor Felton, and he talked about, of course, that particular story, but that wasn't where he focused his energy. He indicated he's still, of course, involved in security research, and as was mentioned, he brought forward a request for an exemption under the DMCA review. He noted that for every 2 hours that he spends in the lab, he spends 1 hour talking to Princeton legal counsel, talking about what he can and can't disclose. Now, I'm someone who is all for talking to lawyers, but I have to say that when our security researchers spend 1/3 of their time talking to lawyers about what they can and can't say, I think you've got a problem. I think you've got a problem when someone like Felton says he knew about Sony rootkit months before it was publicly disclosed by Mark Russinovich on his blog on Halloween Day. He was too busy talking to Princeton lawyers about what he could or could not disclose, while thousands of consumers were inserting these CDs onto their computers and putting them at risk. There's the Skylink case, which of course gets a lot of attention. This is the garage door remote case. It's interesting from a Canadian perspective because Skylink's a Canadian company. Now, the people behind Skylink had the money to fight through successive litigation, not just within the US courts, but within the International Trade Court as well in the United States. Yet how many companies are simply unable to fight? How many companies take a look at this and consult a lawyer up front and they say, you know what, you're pushing the envelope perhaps a bit too much. This is an invitation to be sued, and so that innovation simply stops. How many security researchers take a look at the Elkomsoft case, where Dmitry Skylarov spent the summer in jail after being arrested for talking about how his company's program could break the encryption on Adobe e-reader? How many prospective scientists take a look at that instance and say, you know what, this is an area that I just don't need to get into. I'm going to do something else. Frankly, it's the untold stories of the DMCA that are the most harmful because they are out there, and all you have to do is dig a little bit to find them. Now, this past summer, I spent a month talking about some of the implications of enacting anti-circumvention legislation in my 30 days of DRM project. So in other words, I can talk for a month about this stuff. I only get 20 minutes, but so I'm going to encourage you, if you're interested in some of the implications from a Canadian perspective, to take a look, because it runs the gamut from something as simple as legal deposit, the notion that our libraries ought to be collecting everything that's published. And yet, fairly recently, we had the Minister of Canadian Heritage sign a new order, cabinet order, that has changed the rules that will require those that want to submit books to our National Library in DRM form to strip out the DRM and provide the keys, because the ability for future generations to access that cultural heritage may well be imperiled. And at the other end, of course, we've got privacy and a range of other issues that are implicated. Even when we make attempts to try to put forward sort of as good an implementation as one might get, C60 was arguably that. We've had many scholars come forward and suggest there are problems, and David Lametti was one of the contributors to this book in the public interest. 19 contributions from scholars from across the country, available from Irwin Law as a free download, if you like, under a Creative Commons license. So there's lots out there to suggest that there is harm. Frankly, the markets increasingly oppose as well. So there was a reference to eMusic as an experiment here. That experiment is the second largest online music seller in the world, selling DRM-free music. I don't see paying for something as an access DRM. It's simply a business model, and the business model is providing the content in MP3 form and saying that we think that that's where the market lies. It's not just them, though. It's Zunior is another example. This is a lesser-known Canadian online music store. And to show you that the impact that DRM has had, take a look, if you might, at the very top line. This is what they are trying to sell here. All music is completely unrestricted and uses no DRM. All music plays on your iPod or any MP3 player. Own your music and play it wherever you want. The market has evolved to the point, this market that we are told is doing well, has evolved to the point that you must put out essentially a cigarette pack warning on your very front page to say, don't worry, if you buy this, you can use it in whatever way you like. Of course, Pure Tracks, ironically started by CREA President Graham Henderson, just a couple of weeks ago, announced that they've got now 50,000 songs that are available in DRM-free form. It turns out that using DRM wasn't providing a particularly good business model, and they're looking to ramp up to 250,000 rather quickly. In Europe, Musiclo, run by Deutsche Telekom this week, noted that 3/4 of their customer service complaints are DRM related, saying this is no way to run a business when our costs from a customer service perspective are all in terms of dealing with these interoperability and consumer related concerns. Of course, there's the jobs letter that was noted earlier, but it's not just jobs. It's Yahoo, it's Real Networks, it's frankly all the major online music distributors who are screaming to the industry that this is a problem. And I don't think it's being disingenuous to do that. It's simply good business. It's good business that the distributors recognize. Unfortunately, the industry itself hasn't. It's not just the markets that are increasingly opposing this, it's creators as well. For those that are unaware, a year ago, some of Canada's best-known musicians, Avril Lavigne, Sarah McLachlan, Sam Roberts, Bare Naked Ladies, and others came together to form this group, the Canadian Music Creators Coalition, the CMCC, who came out for a number of principles, most notably no DRM, no suing fans, no anti-circumvention. These are our musicians in this country, and they're saying this is not the approach that they want to take. And it's more than just people in the music business. It's, to give you another example, Jane Siberry, whose site actually provides a pay-as-you-like model. Turns out when you use a pay-as-you-like model, download and pay what you think is appropriate, the average selling price is $1.30 a track. People pay more than they would have to if they went to something like iTunes because she trusts in her fans. But it's more than just music. There's Appropriation Art, a group where there are hundreds of visual artists, more than 600 in fact, representing from across the country, almost every province represented, artists who have won every major art award in this country, Governor General Awards, Molson Prize Awards, artists who say that for us the concern with copyright is access. We don't want to see things locked down. We don't want to see anti-circumvention. We do want you to take a look at something like extending fair dealing or fair use. There's the Documentary Organization of Canada, representing nearly 150 documentary filmmakers in this country, including Oscar nominees, and they come forward and they say similarly, we don't need anti-circumvention legislation, we don't need DRM, we do need greater certainty of access within fair use. There's the privacy and security concerns that are associated with this, and so in this country, we have privacy commissioners, and just last year we had four of the most prominent privacy commissioners, including the federal commissioner, come forward alongside many privacy groups and civil liberties groups to all say that they are deeply concerned about the privacy implications of what DRM might mean. It happens in security as well, where more than a dozen security companies in Canada have come forward to express concern about what DMCA-like legislation might look like. Frankly, as we heard from Bruce Lehman, the truth of the matter is this stuff is ineffective anyway, right? I mean, Napster, its entire life, has existed under the DMCA, yet the DMCA has done nothing, frankly, to stop that online file sharing, nor has the lawsuits, nor has any of these attempts to wield the law to stop something that is seemingly not going away anytime soon. And then, frankly, from a Canadian perspective, it is unnecessary. We heard about how there are all these great business models in the United States, and we are told, being created or being supported through anti-circumvention legislation. Well, here's the news. We have those business models here too, and we don't have anti-circumvention legislation in Canada. 90% of new Canadian music is created by independent labels, and for those independent labels, they're finding that they're getting a lot of success, and they are not using DRM. Here's what Canadian Heritage had to say in their most recent report on the state of the Canadian music industry. Canadian artists have seen their sales increase since 2001. Sales of albums have increased. In contrast, foreign artists have seen their sales fall by 20% over the same period. The result is a remarkable increase in Canadian artists' share of sales in Canada from 16% in 2001 to 25% in 2004. Now, Bruce Lehman talked about that 20% decline. We also experienced a 20% decline in foreign artists. But from a Canadian perspective, where, as I say, 90% of that new Canadian music is being created, they aren't experiencing a decline. There isn't a problem here. In fact, there are increasing numbers of success stories. And in fact, as I say, there are lots and lots of these business models happening. In Canada, we've already seen Pure Tracks and Zunior, but there is, of course, here in Canada, iTunes, there's Archambault, there is Sony's Connect service, there's Napster, there's TELUS. They don't have anti-circumvention legislation supporting them, and we could talk about other industries as well. They simply have a marketplace that may or may not respond to these offerings, but they don't need anti-circumvention legislation in order to do it. And coming soon is Spiral Frog, which is going to launch here as well. It unquestionably uses DRM, which I suggest may result in something that doesn't work all that well, but the opportunities are there, and we don't need the law to do it. In fact, if one takes a look at the numbers from Nielsen SoundScan last year, this is the data in terms of the growth of digital music sales. In the United States, sales grew by 65%, in Europe by 80%. In this country, digital music sales grew by 122%. Almost double the rate of growth in the United States. We do not have a DMCA. We are told we have lots and lots of increasing numbers of these services, and in fact, Canadians are buying. Folks, it's not about lost respect for copyright. It's about lost respect for consumers. And consumers recognize that, and those that aren't buying because of that. Now, we are often told in this context that we have no choice. We hear it from the US Ambassador Wilkins fairly recently, from US senators like Feinstein and Cornyn. Respectfully, we hear it from the IIPA, who talk about how Canada is offside. The reality is we do have a choice. We have a choice as to whether or not we decide to move forward on this kind of legislation or take a look at the reality of what's taking place in the marketplace and say it's simply unnecessary. If we do move forward, we certainly have the choice in terms of how we might implement this legislation and not follow the DMCA lead. Now that's our choice, and we have to choose wisely. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Michael. Let's move. I mean, Michael talked a lot about innovation and new models, as have Bruce and Anne. Well, we have an example of someone who's trying to develop a new model, and that's Terry Fisher.
Let me react briefly to the presentations by some of the previous panelists. I agree with Michael that digital rights management, or I think as Zan rightly suggested, more properly called technological protection measures, have many disadvantages from a social welfare standpoint and a consumer standpoint. I would focus on the following, each of which I think are latent in, or made explicit in Michael's presentation. So the first disadvantage of TPMs is that when they rest on software to shield, to restrict either access or use of a work, they are ineffective. So each of the technologies that's been developed thus far has been cracked reasonably quickly, some cases by Princeton computer scientists, in some cases by 12-year-old Norwegians. And most recently, the Blu-ray copyright protection system, which was supposed to be much more robust than its predecessors, has been cracked. So, and most computer scientists predict that so long as we continue to rely on software, we will fail to effectively shield entertainment works against reproduction. That's first point. Second point is there exists technology that would be effective. That's hardware-based encryption systems. In the United States, there was a proposal some years ago, most enthusiastically backed by the Disney Corporation, to require the manufacturers of consumer electronic equipment to embed in all of their devices technology that would recognize and respect watermarks. That would work, but it would have quite substantial disadvantages of the sort that my colleague Jonathan Zittrain outlines in a forthcoming book, in terms of substantially reducing the flexibility of the personal computers and other electronic devices upon which we have increasingly come to depend, not only for our personal uses, but for innovation. That's the second point. Third point is, as Michael indicates, in practice, business models based on digital rights management tend to lead to impediments to interoperability. We get format rigidity in this world. And finally, in practice, though not necessarily in theory, in practice, digital rights management, TPM systems, tend to impede the resurgence of amateurism, the semiotic democracy, the efflorescence of creativity that David indicated at the outset is one of the wonders of this new technological space. So that in brief are the reasons why I agree that TPMs are not the way to try to solve the crisis in the entertainment industry. On the other hand, I'm a good deal less confident than Michael that the experiments currently underway throughout the world in selling non-TPM'd recordings will succeed in saving the industry. And in this respect, I think Bruce Lehman's more pessimistic assessment of the relative magnitude, on the one hand, of the declining fortunes of the existing business models and the rising fortunes of the new business models is thus far more accurate. As Bruce explained, the revenue streams from the old world are falling much faster than the revenue streams from the new world are rising. So we can't relax now, confident that the innovations already on the table will solve the problem. More hard thinking, more experimentation needs to be done. So in that vein, as David indicated, I've been working for some time on developing yet another in this set of experiments that's based upon a significantly different approach. In particular, it doesn't contemplate selling to individual consumers TPM'd or non-TPM'd embodiments of recordings. It works a little bit differently. So this is the model. It's come to be known as no-ank media, for reasons I won't go into here unless you're curious. In brief, here's how the system works. An organization, name will vary by country, stands as an intermediary between creators on the one hand and access providers on the other. So no-ank obtains licenses from content providers and information that they provide in a registration phase, which subsequently functions to provide metadata that alongside the fingerprints we create enables us to keep track of recordings. No-ank deals with not individual consumers, but with access providers, providers of access to the internet, each of whom already has large numbers of members who pay typically subscription fees. So no-ank issues licenses through the access providers to the individual members and also provides them the recordings themselves, in the first instance through seeding servers, and then as soon as the recording is in circulation, relies upon a peer-to-peer distribution model, a variant of the BitTorrent technology. Money necessary to compensate the content providers comes from the access providers. They can, if they wish, pass along those costs to their members. They can even charge a premium if they wish, or they can absorb the cost themselves. It's up to them. In addition, no-ank media issues licenses for free, meaning non-fee-based licenses, to any of a variety of organizations that want to provide to the members of the eligible access providers services. We have no aspiration to provide the array of services that are currently technologically possible and valued by consumers, like high speed or high quality streaming, or the myriad of recommendation engines that are increasingly available to enable people to sift through the wonderful array of digital recordings now available online. 85% of the revenue collected in this fashion is distributed to the content providers. That's a higher percentage than any other comparable organization in the world. Some observers are skeptical that we can actually achieve this, but so far anyway, the numbers seem to work. Now here's a critical point. The money is distributed on the basis of the relative popularity of each recording. So to know the relative popularity of each recording, we have to track the frequency with which recordings are watched or listened to on the machines to which they are downloaded, on connected portable players, and through streaming sites. This is the one component of the system that has required us to develop new technology, and we have now done this for one of the three relevant platforms, the Windows-based platform, and we're now confident of our ability also to have a system that works on Linux and OS X. This is an issue to which it may be useful to return during the discussion, because latent in this technology are many complications, but the critical one worth some discussion here is the tension between the privacy concerns, to which Michael alluded in his presentation, and on the other hand, the hazard associated with any system of this sort of gaming. Those two things have to be balanced. A portion of the money that we retain is used to pay an online arbitration service necessary to resolve the disputes among content providers concerning who owns which recordings. The notice and takedown system to which Anne referred is a manageable but clumsy device for resolving these controversies, and we want to use a more efficient one. In addition to the primary business model just suggested, there's a potential secondary one here in which information concerning aggregate, not individual usage patterns is made available to advertisers who then place advertisements on the system and provide independent source of revenue, which again is transferred 85% of it to the content providers. Okay, so who are these organizations? Well, in the category of content providers are many of the organizations we've already heard about this morning. The money distributed to them will be transferred, portions of it anyway, according to contracts they already have, to the artists, and then portions of that money are likely to funnel back into the system through advertising and promotion. In addition, the sellers of other goods and services would make use of this advertising potential. The access providers come in four baskets: broadband providers, mobile phone providers, universities, and companies, each of which have significant groups of individual subscribers. All right, that's the system in general. Now, the chances of getting it off the ground in the first instance in the United States are slim. So instead, we've begun to work with jurisdictions where there's more initial enthusiasm, and in particular, we've begun with China. So I'll finish my presentation by sketching the progress of the system in China and then suggest by way of analogy how it might be spread to other jurisdictions, including, second, we hope, Canada. So the Chinese version of NOAC is known by the name Feiliu, which means roughly, comes from an ancient Chinese poem meaning water falling from the sky, sort of a cascade, not rain. It's now a Hong Kong corporation, a subsidiary of NOAC Media. It functions basically the way I just described, and we have, in order to launch the system, made arrangements with a variety of, on the one hand, content providers, and on the other hand, internet access providers. So here are some of the organizations that have signed up to provide material at a minimum for a test of the system, starting in September of 2007. They include major video aggregators like Shanghai Media Group, which is the second largest aggregator of video content in China, mainland China, Radio Television Hong Kong, which also has a very large stock of materials. The color coding here are black, or organizations have already committed to participate. Blue are those that have expressed interest, and green are those we're still interested in pursuing. R2G is an organization that purports, anyway, to have the ability to provide us licenses to the full array of Chinese-based audio musical compositions. Then within the world of sound recording copyrights, Jingwen Records has already signed up, and we've had promising discussions with some others, China Records, Life Records, and so forth. That's a quick sketch of some of the folks on the content side. On the access side, we've been talking with many people, but we've gone furthest by far with an organization called CERNET, an entity partially owned by Tsinghua University, with whom we are closely partnering in China. Tsinghua University is the analog in China to MIT in North America, the leading technological university. And the three of us together, NOANC, Tsinghua, and CERNET, now have entered into a set of contracts under which we will provide this service to all university students in China that CERNET serves. This is approximately 20 million university students. The plan is to launch the system in 10 universities, a small subset, in the fall of 2007, and then our goal, anyway, is to reach the whole system by fall of 2008. We also have an arrangement with a smaller but still substantial group of students, university, primary, and secondary in Hong Kong through this organization called Cyberport. So one of the principles here is an idea that Sandy Perlman has been advocating for a long time, which is that if you can devise a system that reaches very large numbers of people, then you don't have to collect from each individual much money in order to provide very substantial revenue streams to the content owners. So that's the basic setup. I'd be happy to answer questions about it. We are hopeful that this will provide in China a solution to the severe crisis there. In a week and a half, we have to provide a demonstration of the technology on which we've been working furiously for the last couple of months in Beijing. And if that goes well, then, as I say, we hope to have an operational version by fall of 2007. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I notice in terms of time, we're supposed to be on break. However, I also know that there's been a non-confirmation on the second panel, which gives us a little more flexibility. So I would propose that at least among panelists for the time being, I might open the floor for a few minutes. Note that all of this will be on the table this afternoon for all of you to participate, either to ask your own questions or if you're a bit more shy, to write down questions after this session, after the next session, which we will collect over lunch and use as a basis for the afternoon discussion as well. But for the time being, I know that Anne had asked to.
I just quickly wanted to respond to many of the things that you said, Michael. Very briefly, I'll do this in 2 minutes, okay? I think that the slides that he showed from what the internet looked like in 1997 and what he showed that it looks like in 2007 shows that we didn't guess wrong. We allowed all these new services to develop. You know, he talked to Pure Tracks. Pure Tracks was recently quoted as saying, you know, if Canada doesn't do something about peer-to-peer, our business might not survive. And I also was talking to the person from Pure Tracks, and he said to me, and the problem also is no new business models like ours can start because nobody can get funding. So then when he talked about all the new business services that are available in Canada, notice that most of those aren't Canadian. So it is a problem. And then he put up a whole bunch of examples that are, you know, how great things are. Lonely Girl, Creative Commons, movies that the owners make available, the MIT courseware, open source. All of that is totally consistent with the DMCA and not, you know, not inhibited by it. The great thing about the law is that you can use TPMs, you don't have to. The whole thing of what's happening in MP3 and with the consumers' issues with mostly interoperability, not with the DRM as much as they're not being able to be interoperable, is something that's being worked out in the market, and I think that's a great thing. And one other thing that the DMCA provides real fast is rights management information, which I think your system is going to rely on. You talked about how you just developed a system, and rights management information, which is protected in the DMCA, is, you know, the information that's attached, the watermark or the information that's attached to the CD that says, you know, who the copyright owner is, who the artist is, things like that. And you just talked about how important it will be in your new system. And it's critical then to have a law that says, you know, I can't go in there and change the information if he, you know, if his system says, well, you know, picking an artist that nobody's going to like, so it's okay. You know, so you can't go in and say, like, everything that's Britney Spears is, I can't go in and change it and say, it's Ann Shaded, so I can get all the money. You know, that's something that should be prohibited and that the DMCA prohibits. And because what the protection of RMI is going to do for artists is it will let artists get paid for exactly their uses, for all their uses. The new technologies permitting artists to get paid, you know, on a census basis for every use. You know, how many artists have you heard complain about, oh, I didn't show up in the survey, so, you know, I know my song was played on the radio, but I didn't show up in the survey, so I didn't get paid. Well, that's not going to happen anymore. I think this NOINC, I think looks like it's a great, interesting system. It does rely on, you know, licenses and permissions. So it, you know, it's based on copyright. It seems to me that it will be great, and I though can see it in the future, maybe not in China. I don't know, the, what did you call it? The server, the Chinese the university server. CERNET. I don't know if they're going to have an access TPM so that you have to prove that you are actually a university student to have access to it. But I could certainly imagine if you were to bring this to another country, maybe to the US, where the ISP say, well, I'm not going to charge every single person because my 70-year-old customers aren't listening to music. So everybody who wants to can take advantage of this, and there would be an access TPM on it, and then the service would work the exact same way. I mean, this service seems like it could be very cool, and I think it's the kind of business models that are going to be tested and, you know, and develop in this new disruptive circumstance that we have from technology.
Let me ask all of our panelists and all of you, because I know there are levels of expertise in the room as well, to reflect on the following question, which we will come back to this afternoon. Do you think that the kinds of changes that have been outlined by various panelists, as well as the alternative regime, or the regime, whether it's an alternative or not, remains to be seen in conceptual terms, is a result of legislation like the DMCA, or whether all this has developed in spite of the DMCA, or in fact whether the DMCA is working against such schemes such as NOANC or some of the ideas that Michael presented. I mean, that's really the debate joined. Right? What's the role of the DMCA in all of this? Positive, negative, neutral?
I think you've raised the central question.
Well, I think
I think that the DMCA is virtually irrelevant to the issues that Michael Geist has raised. In that, first of all, using the DMCA, what we're talking about is encrypting works or technological controls put on works. First of all, you know, there's absolutely nothing requiring anybody to put technological controls on anything. So if you want a business model that doesn't have anything to do with that, you don't have to. The fact is that, as we have seen, the DMCA and the capacity to at least stop people from using or have some tools to use people from engaging in anti-circumvention technological activity has not prevented unauthorized file sharing to the point where it is having a very negative effect on the industry. That's really just the central point. And so it seems to me that there's a little bit of an overreaction to the DMCA, and I think that Professor Fisher's model, by the way, is very interesting. It's what it really is. It's just another iteration of the most robust and successful of all copyright models, and that is the collecting society, which Anne referred to earlier, is, you know, as being the healthy part of music, quote, music publishing business. I just have a question, and that is, how do you, the problem is a great model. The problem is, how do you get people to pay for it? Because in the end, the individual consumer has to be a member or put up this money. So what's the motivation for the consumer to do that, unless you have some kind of, you know, to some degree, we have this like traditionally in the UK, where, you know, you pay a tax and you buy a radio or television, and that supports the BBC. I mean, that would be one way of doing it. But in the absence of something like that, how do you get a consumer to pay for it?
The critical question that we confront anyway is slightly different. Is how do you get the access providers to sign up? Because the consumers, in the way in which we're deploying it, have no choice, meaning that it's not offered as an option to subscribers. A particular access provider signs up or doesn't sign up, and then the consumers are brought along.
So it's the access provider then that's basically the control mechanism. So if I sign up to I guess would this be like my cable television access provider that provides me with my high-speed access? Is that where
one potential participant, yeah, Comcast would be an example
Yeah,
here.
mm-hmm.
But, so the question is, so why would such an organization sign up? Wouldn't they fear that their subscribers would flee to competitors, for example? So these were hypotheses in the beginning, guesses, but at least so far they seem to be panning out, in China at least. And so here are the motivations. The first one is anxiety concerning tightening legal controls. The second one is technological advantages. A system of this sort makes it possible to relocate the distribution mechanism within the system itself and to reduce the loads on the pipes coming into the system. This is an especially big deal for universities, which currently devote, in most instances in North America, more than half of their bandwidth to traffic from remote peer-to-peer file sharing systems, and if they could cache and have local distribution, they could save a lot of bandwidth. And the third of the advantages is many of these organizations seem to regard it as a sufficiently attractive service to be provided to their customers that they gain more in terms of people subscribing to their system than they lose for those who don't want it. That at least has been the response in China. Now, return, however, one last time to, it's basically Sandy's point is, all of this only works if the amounts of the charges are modest. Once they get big, then the incentives for individual subscribers to bail out and the disincentive for ISPs to sign up become large. And it is for that reason that it's critical to get large groups involved from the beginning and then distribute the cost of running the system across them. In answer to your central question, what does the DMCA have to do with all this, or anti-circumvention? Anti-circumvention legislation is not necessary to run a system of this sort. Anne's correct that tracking files is essential, but you actually don't need prohibitions on circumvention to do that. I could describe why, but you don't need it. For the technology does not depend upon any prohibitions on circumvention. So the DMCA is not necessary for this. The reason why I think the issues are connected is that the principal justification for anti-circumvention legislation is that it has some disadvantages, to be sure, in frustrating research uses or fair uses or interoperability and so forth. But it's necessary in order to save a dying industry. So we should adopt it because it's a cure and a necessary cure for what ails us. And I think the way in which these presentations connect up is at least my hypothesis that if you can identify a different solution that doesn't incur the disadvantages of anti-circumvention legislation and the corresponding optional technological protection measures, then you needn't adopt the legislation. And so that's the burden in this context of my presentation is here's a system I'm suggesting that if it flies, does not depend upon technological protection measures and would fill the gap, the very serious gap that exists right now in the entertainment industry and provide the artists who deserve to be compensated with fair compensation.
Can I just ask one question about the RMA, the RMI, because I'm just curious? Okay.
I want to just ask a quick question. What do you envision in terms of the download cost, the minimal cost? Do you have a ballpark figure for the Chinese project? Or will that be set by the
Still under negotiation in China, but a very important point here is that there is no download costs, meaning you don't pay any fee for individual download. This isn't all you can eat. So it's, right. Okay. And so what's the likely fee in China? Well, so, as I say, still under negotiation, no commitments to this, but the numbers being discussed are $8 to $10, the equivalent of Chinese currency, $8 to $10 per student per year. Now, that seems like a small number. It is a small number compared to American numbers, but it's $400 million a year in revenue. It's larger than the entire online music market in China now. So it's the illustration of the principle, you don't need much if it's very widely distributed to support a serious revenue stream. Remember, this is just the university, so we haven't even talked about China Netcom, China Telecom, and the 400 million mobile phone subscribers in China.
Michael, would you like the last word before we break?
Well, I just would be remiss. I think that the Canadian companies would be disappointed to learn that they're not Canadian. I thought the examples that I provided, including TELUS, Zunior, Archambault, Pure Tracks, are all Canadian. I sat on a panel with Alistair Mitchell, who's one of the leaders on Pure Tracks 2 weeks ago at Canadian Music Week, and frankly, his comments aren't necessarily wholly consistent with yours. In fact, the concern that he expressed and the concern that you hear expressed consistently is that if only the majors would allow them to sell the music DRM free, they'd be able to get after the 80% of the market that at the moment they can't sell to because they're iPod users. Right. Further, I'd notice, in terms of the incentives that are happening within Canada, the founders of Flickr and StumbleUpon and iStock Photo, some of the leading new e-commerce companies, all Canadian established, all without the DMCA, would also be disappointed to learn that somehow we don't have investment happening in Canada. The reality is we have a lot of stuff happening, and it's happening, I think, in many respects, in spite of, actually, it's happening, not even in spite, in many respects, it may be happening precisely because we don't have
Actually,
the DMCA.
what I said is Pure Tracks was Canadian.
You suggested the other examples weren't.
And on the slide, after you talked about Pure Tracks, you said, and there are all these other services that are now coming online here. iTunes, Napster, I wrote down, and a bunch of them, and they're not all American. They're multinational, but they're not Canadian. And the guy from Pure Tracks, and they were quoted, you can find it in writing in Billboard, as saying that peer-to-peer, the problems that Canada's having with, or not, the fact that unless Canada cracks down on peer-to-peer, their business model is threatened. And then I said, and when I talked to him, he said, and it's not only their business model, he said, no new business models can get funding here. And that's what I was saying.
Well, I don't think that's been the case. And I would prefer to listen to the Canadian musicians anyway, as opposed to music exec, and the Canadian musicians aren't crying out on this issue. In fact, as I mentioned, many of the leading Canadian musicians are looking at peer-to-peer and saying, you know what, it's providing us with a whole lot of opportunities, and it's also providing us within the neighborhood of $30 to $40 million a year collected through the private copying levy. Another variation, in a sense, on what Professor Fisher has showed us. There are opportunities to make money even off of that kind of copy.
No, and
Okay,
they
I'm
should
gonna-
be able to do that if they want to, but there are those musicians who don't want to, and they shouldn't have to.
Okay.
That's all I'm saying.
I'm going to close this for now, temporarily, because now you've got food for thought over break, generously provided by MBM, Intellectual Property Law, in Ottawa and other installments across the country. We will pick up these themes again, in either or both of the next panel and the afternoon discussion. So you've got some things to think about, some issues to think about. Let's go do it. Thank you to all the panelists.
days, one of these days, and it won't be long, won't be long, won't be long, one of these days. I wanna sit down and write a long letter to all the good friends I've known. One of these days, one of these days, one of these days, and it won't be long, won't be long, won't be long, be long. One of these days, I'm gonna sit down and write a long letter to all the good friends I've known. One of these days, one of these days, one of these days, and it won't be long, won't be long, won't be long. One of these days, one of these days. I saw a gray-haired mother crying softly in her door as she gazed upon the pathway where he'd return no more. Oh Lord, I love to hold my baby just once more. And Lord, I hope we never live to see another war. Will Jesus wash the bloodstains from your hands? Will he welcome you into that peaceful land? Will he forgive the killing, the wars you have planned? Will Jesus wash the bloodstains from your hands? For the bombs you've dropped, the guns you've shot, all in the name of peace. And when the people begged for mercy, you gave them no relief. There's blood on your hands, mister, you'll answer for one day. And the tears you shed on that day will wash your sins away. Will Jesus wash the bloodstains from your hands? Will he welcome you into that peaceful land? Will he forgive the killing, the wars you have planned? Will Jesus wash the bloodstains from your hands? Now you say we could survive a nuclear war, and that you would use rabbits, he would only go so far. The Hiroshima's horrors we'll never forget. For bloodthirsty warriors that don't know when to quit. Will Jesus wash the bloodstains from your hands? Will he welcome you into the peaceful land? Will he forgive the killing, the wars you had planned? Will Jesus wash the bloodstains from your hands?
Okay, welcome back. For this next panel, we are actually going to try to move logically from the first panel we heard this morning into, okay, now we know there are issues, so what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do as Canadians? I think maybe this panel will help structure the policy debate and frame it. I'm sure we're going to talk about legislation and failed legislation, but really I think we're a bit before that stage, so really a policy discussion. We have three panelists today who will be speaking to you. The fact that you have two people with suits on one side, one without, don't take anything by that. This isn't sort of the way it's been set up. This morning was a little more like that, but I think you'll find three very different viewpoints that will be put forward. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about sort of the achievements and accomplishments of each of the panelists. You have them in your materials. I will sort of say a short word on each, though. First, we're going to hear from Charlie Angus, who is the spokesperson for broadcast, cultural, and digital issues for the NDP in the House of Commons. Charlie is both a politician, but also has a background as an artist, and so and is very informed on these issues, unlike some people who are working in the House. So I think we're going to get a very interesting talk from him today. Charles Morgan is a lawyer with the law firm of McCarthy Tetreault, and he's based here in Montreal. I've known Charles for many years, and he practices really as a corporate commercial lawyer in the technology, intellectual property, and communications areas, so sort of the new media areas, and does a lot of public speaking, and I'm sure he will help us understand sort of where we are in terms of legislation and where Canada sits within this whole framework of reform. And finally, we're going to hear from Sandy Perlman, who is sort of producer at large. You can see from his bio, he's worked on a number of different well-known projects, Blue Oyster Cult, The Clash, etc. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you were the guy who Walken played hitting the cowbell in that Blue Oyster Cult skit.
I am the guy that Christopher Walken so inadequately portrays in that.
So maybe you'll pull out your cowbell and we'll hear you clanging.
Actually, I hate cowbell. That's one of the points of the script, of the skit.
So before we start, I do want to make a few comments just to sort of frame what this panel might talk about, and certainly to give you a bit of a heads up as to what the policy debate is. First, a quick comment about Canadian copyright. As I think was made evident this morning, Canada is not the United States when it comes to copyright. We have always marched to the beat of our own drum or to a different drum. Canada's a little different. We have two copyright cultures in Canada. We have both the Anglo-Saxon, possibly American traditions present, very present, but we also have the more civilist copyright traditions, the droit d'auteur, the author's rights approach, very much more influential here than certainly it is in the United States, and arguably even in Britain, which sits within the European Union. And so we have a different style of copyright, and one that is arguably hybridizing itself more with each set of reforms. With respect to the WIPO treaties that we heard this morning about the ones that gave birth really to the DMCA and TPMs and DRM protections, Canada signed them but has not implemented them. And that's, of course, one of the great debates today. Do we have to implement them? That's what the last panel ended on. The other thing that we'll probably hear about is that Canada did attempt recently in the past couple of years to implement them after a long period of doing really not much. And there was a bill known as Bill C-60, which tried to do a lot of different things. And some say that it was really Canada's digital copyright bill. Really what it was a hodgepodge of things that the government felt at the time, this was a Liberal government bill, was needed to bring copyright into the modern age. It didn't pass. The government fell before it could have. It was certainly a bill that was the result of a lot of compromise that had been achieved, and the question is, was it a good bill? Did it make sense, or was it just really sitting somewhere between attempting to achieve a balance between various lobbying interests? And so I'm sure that will come out as well. I think it's also telling that on this panel we actually don't have anyone from the current government to give us their views on copyright, and I think that's actually symbolic. It's symbolic of the fact that I don't think the current government has established a view on copyright reform yet. We've heard them talk about it, they've made a few promises, but really they haven't put anything forward. We similarly don't have anyone from the last government who put forward Bill C-60 to talk to us a little bit about, what the process was there, what they thought, why they thought that was a good bill, why they were trying to push it forward. That's unfortunate. But I think what that does highlight, both of those sort of absences, highlights the fact that here in Canada, and this is purely my own opinion, I think we lack vision and I think we lack leadership in terms of copyright at the governmental level. I think we have now for successive governments. It's such a polarizing and divisive issue, as we heard this morning, and it's so complex that really nobody in politics wants to touch this thing in any serious way, with possibly the exception of Charlie. Because, if it really does end up being, from a political sort of perspective, a lose-lose situation. There are so many different interests at play. It is such a complex situation. The public is absolutely uninformed, and it's very difficult to educate them on these issues, that it is a lose-lose situation. No matter what you do, you're going to upset a lot of people, and they're going to be very vocal about it. So given that sort of framework, we're going to hear first, I guess, from Charlie. A final comment I want to make relates to the demeanor of the debate. It's been very good, very civilized. I've seen these things degenerate into a lot of nastiness at some of the great Canadian schools. I know we're not going to see that today, but...
Don't count on that.
well, there you go. You can throw tomatoes, but make sure it goes to this side of the stage. But let's, we can try to keep the tone down, and that'd be good. Okay, so Charlie.
Well, thank you. It's a great privilege to be here this morning. Great to be sharing the stage again with Sandy Perlman. The last time I met Sandy, I brought my first Clash album to get autographed because my two political heroes are Joe Strummer and Tommy Douglas. Although my daughter is very suspect about Sandy, my 16-year-old said to me the other day, "That's the guy who didn't like Joe Strummer's voice and turned the guitars up." So yeah, I'm just giving you warning, so you might have to take anything he says with a bit of a grain of salt.
That's a libel.
Sue me.
My efforts on his behalf were monumental.
Yeah, it's as a politician, you always take the opportunity to be incredibly partisan while trying to look really noble and above the fray. But I'm actually going to say it's not surprising that we do not have the Liberal representative of the Conservative Party here, partly because it's what I found with the issue of copyright is it's a very complex issue, and politicians by nature do not deal with complex things. I often say to my staff, look, I don't see the yellow marker line for me to sign here. Like, I don't got time to read 20 pages. You're dealing with busy issues. You're dealing with hundreds of variations of issues under all facets. So copyright is something that is a fundamental issue that has to be dealt with, and we're asked to deal with it in terms of legislation, to bring in legislation to deal with numerous competing interests. And what people have to realize about legislation is it's an extremely blunt instrument. At the end of the day, legislation is to move a massive mountain 3 inches, and it might work or it might not work. So what you have in Parliament right now is that the people who are the furthest from the cutting edge are the ones being asked to make the decision about the future business models that are out there. And what's informed the debate up till now have been the lobbyists. I'm going to speak about that in a little bit. But I want to set the context for, I think, the difference between the American experience and the Canadian experience, because we've had a long tradition in Canada of looking to government to being involved in the cultural sector, because we've always had the big bad Americans to be afraid of. The reality is that we're sitting beside the largest, most successful English-speaking entertainment industry in the world, and we're a much smaller market. In fact, our market's so small it's split into 2. We have a francophone market and an anglophone market. So whether it's television, whether it's books, whether it's getting an orchestra to play in Yellowknife, there simply has never been a business case to have Canadian culture. You need some level of a government framework to make that happen. And so we have a tradition in Canada of looking to government to set some playing rules. And when the digital crisis or digital opportunity hit, naturally everybody looked to Parliament and said, oh my God, the cultural carjackers are at the door. You as politicians have to come in and save us. What I'd like to to begin by talking about is, I think we're actually, because we haven't moved quickly on the copyright legislation, there's been some enormous success in Canada and some incredible opportunities for growth that were unpredicted. But we're also on the cusp, I think, of a major threat. I think there is a real issue of threat to the whole future notion that we built through the 20th century of cultural sovereignty on our airwaves, on our, whether it's on radio or television. And these issues have to be dealt with. And I'm going to get out from the minutiae of the this or that of copyright legislation to talk about some broad areas that I think we need to go in terms of government so that we can be there in the digital age the way we need to be as a nation. Starting from the music perspective, I come from a band. I quit school when I was 17. I went on the road with a punk band. We reformed as a Canadian folk institution and toured the country, and basically starved to death by the side of the road, along with hundreds and thousands of other great Canadian bands that I know. Up till a few years ago, it was virtually impossible for a Canadian band to survive and make a living over a long period of time. I'm not going to name the names of groups that were very successful in Canada who were making $300 a week, and they were all on hock to record companies. But the experience of playing music in Canada makes you realize why we were ripe for digital revolution. Because if you're trying to cross from Toronto to Vancouver, almost every stop is 12 hours. And you cannot afford to have a night off. So we would play till 3 in the morning, and then we would drive all night to our, from Winnipeg to Regina, from Regina to Calgary. And you had small pockets of fans who just, if a band came, they loved it. So these weren't big markets, they were extremely small markets. And the labels were very poor because there just wasn't the bottom line to service these markets. So Canadians are used to latching onto something and holding on to something, and then the internet came along. And suddenly, people were able to hear the music they wanted to hear. And I think Canadians have, because of our tradition, as I explained, we're very quick to latch onto this. At the same time, we see with the major labels, I mean, they're crying foul, and definitely maybe they have a certain case, but where I live in a town of 5,000, where do the kids go to buy a record? They go to Zeller's. So it's great if you like Garth Brooks or the Eagles' greatest hits. But you're not going to get Broken Social Scene there, and you're not going to get the Arctic Monkeys there. And if you want an Arctic Monkeys song, you don't want to necessarily spend $23. You want the song just like your grandparents wanted the song when it was a 45. So there was a market out there, but it wasn't being tapped because, frankly, the labels didn't want you to tap the market the way you wanted it. And that allowed, of course, kids went to find the music. They went to find the song. And so it created this whole, some would say, illegal market, but it created a market. And I think what we need to look at is how do we start to monetize that market? We got to move the copyright debate, and Parliament is still, you hear about the digital threat. A lot of the language has been this great cultural tsunami that's threatened our entire landscape. It's like, get over it, folks. I know you people are there, but Parliament isn't. They don't know that OK Go got on the Grammys because they were on YouTube. No record label ever would have gotten them on the Grammys. They got on the Grammys because they were seen on YouTube. They took off. Broken Social Scene's another example. They're playing Europe to packed houses without a distribution deal, and they're making money because of the internet. So there's a digital opportunity out there for music that is very exciting in Canada. And again, the sales of Canadian music has taken off because of the digital opportunities. So the question is, I think this issue of the TPMs and the DRMs, it's a side issue for us in Parliament. What we need to look at is how do we monetize and make sure that that system is working. The other issue out there at the same time is where are we going to go with our other elements of our cultural fabric, which is television, film, radio, because those markets are still there. I don't believe we are in the post-copyright era. I think we are, as Anne said, we're having to look at the new models. The real threat in Canada right now is that if we don't put the money into getting our cultural product online, we will be left at the side of the road very, very quickly. And the market is moving as quickly in the area of television and broadcast as it did 5 years ago in music. And we have not come to terms with that as a cultural community. And I think there is a real serious threat. And every artist group, every television producers organization can come cry to government, but it's going to be too late to try and implement laws to protect Canadian content on the internet. It can't be done. The only way you can protect Canadian content on the internet is to get Canadian content on the internet. And we're seeing this real problem right now. We had CBC before the Heritage Committee just this week, and I asked them about them getting their back catalog of all those shows for all those decades. Well, they can't license them to get them on the internet. So it's sitting in a vault. That's the ultimate technological protection measure there is not being able to see it, period. Meanwhile, BBC's on YouTube. My kids watch BBC every night now. They love the shows. They don't watch TV. So there is an issue of how do we get our cultural fabric, our cultural films, how do we get them onto viewing platforms, and how do we monetize that? That's the argument we need to be talking about. I'm going to just talk a little bit about where we're at in terms of copyright. The first stab at copyright was the Bolte report done in the 38th Parliament. And it was very much informed by the sense of panic and fear that we were hearing from the lobbyists. Well, I don't have to say his name, but he knows who he is. Came to me one time when I was first elected, and he said to me, he was a big lobbyist, he said, "Charlie, do you know what the internet is?" Well, I kind of had a pretty good idea what I thought the internet was. But I said, "No, tell me." He said, "It's a highway of child pornography and stolen goods going into every bedroom in every kid's bedroom in this country." Oh my God, so as a politician, what am I supposed to do? How do I stop this? What do we do? Well, electronic toll booths. You know, they called it the license to steal community. Educators were the license to steal crowd. We have to put locks on universities. We have to make sure, and that was the fabric of fear that came out of the 2004 copyright move, and that went nowhere. Bill C-60 was a bit more in the middle. Well, maybe it's still a big threat, but maybe the educators are right. Maybe they should be allowed some way to get their stuff to remote schools, but we'll still have to make sure that we're protecting our artists. Meanwhile, the artists are moving on. So my issue here, and I'll end now, and it's probably been fairly incoherent, is that copyright is messy. At the end of the day, it's about putting people in a room and fighting over the pennies. And politicians can establish some broad frameworks of how to do that, but that fight will go on. But at this point, we need to set the big picture issues, which is that we need to find a way to monetize what's happening out there and make it possible. But we also, as government, need to start saying to all our cultural sectors, we have to take it seriously, and there's going to be a need for government investment to get our cultural products online, and we're going to have to do it soon. And we can't sit there. Otherwise, our television and our film industry, which is challenged at the best of times, is going to be left entirely by the side of the road and protected from any form of theft or intervention because nobody will be seeing it. So that's where I think we need to move with copyright in this next Parliament. I'm actually hoping that we can get all four parties to start looking at the business models and try and finding a way that we can actually move forward.
I'm going to actually wait with the other panelists till the end, but given that Charles is going to spend a second or two getting his presentation up, any questions on that? Seems ironic. I think we've heard the NDP say they want to let the market decide. So.
Well, that's the problem when you're socialist. You believe in a free market, but to keep it free, you sometimes need government to intervene to protect people's interests.
I guess just following on that, what are your thoughts on sort of extending digital taxes on digital media versus a solution like Terry Fisher's, which is a sort of more private way of basically collecting a lot of money from, collecting little amounts of money from.
Well, this is going to be the discussion we need to have. I think at the end of the day, the job of government is to ensure that there's a level playing field for artists. So however that money is accumulated, there has to be some basic fee structures in place. I've been a big supporter of the blank tape levy. I think it's been a progressive levy. What I found is interesting is that the Canadian recording industry is against the blank tape levy. I think they're against it because they don't want to be going into court when they sue kids and be told that this mitigated against their damages. I think that system of saying we're going to get a small percentage off every CD that's sold and every recordable device, and it's going to go into a fund. Now, has that fund been used? Not very much. Has it been accessed properly? Not very well. But it's a good idea. And so there is a problem when you allow government to collect all the money for you because they end up sitting on it and they're not very good at getting it out. So there is a private option out there, and I think there is an element that will work if we go to whether it's Rogers downloads or whatever. I have no problem with that. But we need to set some ground rules about what the return is going to be for the artist and for the product.
I'm sure this afternoon we're going to discuss collective rights administration and all of the positives and negatives that come with that sort of a theme. Charles.
Excuse me. Yeah, thanks a lot, Sonny. I've been told I have about 13 minutes to speak, so I'll put my entire presentation on an outline slide. That way I can say the whole thing at once, and if I don't get to the last 2/3 of the presentation, there's no real problem. I'm going to spend just three things I want to talk about. You'll see that in comparison to some of the other people who've spoken today, I'm going to be a little bit more heavy on the law part of this as a lawyer. I think that's what I've been asked to do. And I'm going to speak a little bit about specifically the legal framework for the protection of technological protection measures in Canada. So presentations in 3 parts. One is just touching very, very briefly on the context. What should we do and what should we not do in terms of a legislative response to that shifting technological context. So in a word, I think it's been, everyone recognizes that there has been a huge shift in technology. Individuals are both consumers of digital works, but also potentially very easily global publishers of those works. And that has meant, and I was interested in Charlie came on the point over and over again, you have to figure out a way of monetizing these works because, of course, when one person can post something on an internet website and everybody else can have free access to it, that becomes a real issue for those who've invested the money in creating the content. Now, the last point here is that a massive technological change creates an imbalance in the traditional copyright system. And there have been those who've argued, including Michael Geist, that the DMCA or other laws that are intended to protect technical protection measures throw out the traditional balance that has been found in copyright laws between the rights of users and the rights of creators. What I would say is there have always been TPMs. I mean, just try to copy easily a vinyl record or try to copy easily in the time of the printing, before the time of the printing press, the Bible, for instance. There were always measures, they were technological protection measures that were inherent to the nature of the technology of the day. The fact that the technology has changed has meant that we now have to implement new technology measures so that creators of works, authors of works, and those who distribute those works can also monetize their efforts. And we're talking about a context in which BitTorrent, for instance, in 2005 accounted apparently for roughly 35% of all the traffic on the internet. So it just gives you a sense of the incredible volume of works that are being transmitted in a culture where increasingly it's deemed that digital content is free. So what should we do, and this is where I'm going to get a little bit specific about Canada, but looking at Canada in the context of a worldwide issue. Michael suggested that the WIPO Treaty was written at a time, 1996, when we were in a totally different world. But the fact is, the WIPO Treaty represents a statement of principle, which is to say, among other things, on the TPM issue, that contracting parties shall provide adequate legal protection and effective legal remedies against the circumvention of effective technological measures that are used by authors in connection with the exercise of their rights. There's been a lot of discussion so far about the situation in the United States and how does Canada compare to the United States, and should we be sort of bulldozed by what's going on there? The fact of the matter is this is a WIPO treaty. This is an international treaty to which I'll get the numbers wrong, but a lot of countries, 80, somebody correct me, 60, thank you, countries have subscribed to. And so it's in other words, it's an international standard that has been recognized, and it's been recognized for good reason. It's also been implemented for good reason, and Canada is amongst our major trading partners, is one of the last to implement the WIPO Treaty obligations. Now, you might say, okay, it's broad general language. We could do a lot of things. We have committed to. We've signed the WIPO Treaty, and we've committed to ratify in national legislation its principles. You might say we have a lot of discretion as a sovereign nation to implement it the way we want, but discretion is not unfettered. There are very clear principles in the WIPO treaties, and there are sort of 5 different, a member of our firm did an analysis of how the WIPO treaty had been implemented in something like 60 countries around the world, and you see the same sorts of provisions coming up over and over again. And those provisions were intended to avoid, let's see if I have it, I don't have it, to avoid the circumvention of access control, TPMs, to avoid the circumvention of copy control, TPMs, to prohibit the distribution of tools that would circumvent access or copy TPMs, and to implement criminal sanction for the most egregious circumstances. And you see the same kind of language being introduced in copyright legislation around the world. That's the international context. We're not in a policy vacuum. We've had the benefit recently of having the Supreme Court of Canada treat the issue, very, very important issues of copyright law at the Supreme Court level in a number of seminal cases, including Théberge and SOCAN. And you see some principles coming to the fore in these decisions that I think any legislative efforts will have to consider as the drafting process advances. The point that I want to make here is that it's often the copyright. This issue is often presented as if it's a zero-sum game. You either are on the side of the users, or you're on the side of the rights holders, but you can't be you can't be anywhere in the middle. And I think what is clear in these decisions is that copyright is concerned with with balancing the public interest, which is to encourage the dissemination of works. But it has always been deemed that the best way of doing that is to ensure that those who create the works are paid for their efforts. We are in the culture of free is good. You know, I can get whatever I want. I can go on to Kazaa or BitTorrent or wherever else, and I can get, you know, access to every single song in the world for free. Well, that's wonderful, but does free mean without cost? I think, and I won't get into it, but obviously we've seen there are serious costs. Charlie referred, for instance, to the starving artist on the street. If there isn't a mechanism to ensure that artists and those backing them get paid for their work, then we are not acting in the public interest. Just a statement of principle out of the SOCAN decision of the Supreme Court. The capacity of the internet to disseminate works of the arts and the intellect is one of the great innovations of the information age. Its use should be facilitated rather than discouraged, but this should not be done unfairly and at the expense of those who created the works of art and intellect in the first place. Okay. I thought Bruce's background comments at the beginning of his presentation were particularly interesting, and there's something that I think it's important to bear in mind. When we're looking at the TPM measures that are under consideration, I think it's important to see them in the context of a whole range of legislation that has been adopted and a policy framework that has been adopted to encourage e-commerce in Canada and in the United States and around the world. Our policy framework for e-commerce, which would include, I think, commerce in digital works, includes our privacy legislation, which some of you may be familiar with the fact that, or aware of the fact that in Europe, the privacy or the data protection directive, which puts in place all kinds of protections for individuals for their use of personal information, was intended to facilitate the flow of personal data across national boundaries in the information age. Similarly, in Canada, so in other words, you have to put in certain legal protections to avoid the most egregious abuses that can happen in the information age in order to really benefit from what is available to us in the age of the internet. So that's the privacy sphere. Internet sales template, contract template. In Canada, we have a whole harmonization process that's going on to make sure that when we're dealing with the consumers are protected against the most egregious forms of interaction on the internet. And I think it's important to situate TPM legislation in that context because, in a sense, wonderful to be able to disseminate these works all around the world, but the egregious danger of doing that, if there isn't any legal measure put in place to protect yourself, is that you're forgetting completely the rights of the content producers and the rights holders. And which isn't to say, and I touched on it on the last slide, you have to completely forget the other competing interests when you're putting in place these sorts of things. I think it is important to acknowledge privacy concerns when you're talking about technical protection measures. But in Canada, we already have in place PIPEDA and other data protection legislation. You do want to avoid the dangers of digital lockup, but as we have seen again and again in the presentations of this morning, the DMCA experience suggests that it's just not nearly as big an issue as it has been suggested. And I think, and this is an important point, we really do have to act in a manner that is consistent with our key trading partners, and not just the United States, but Europe. We don't exist in a vacuum, and digital content is an asset of extreme economic value, and if we want to exist in the community of nations and ensure trade with our trading partners, we have to protect the value that is accorded to such assets. What should we not do? I have less than 5 minutes. We should not adopt Bill C-60, which Sunny referred to in its current form, or as it had been put before the House previously. As I say, our law firm did extensive, in-depth analysis of Bill C-60 and compared it to other similar legislation around the world and determined that it was absolutely the weakest legislation in the world for protecting TPMs. As I say, we do have some flexibility in terms of how WIPO principles are implemented, but it's not unfettered. These are a list of some countries that you could compare. And the point is, and I won't go through them all, but there have been a number of instances where the DMCA has been used in these cases and others to address egregious issues of abuse, whereby the rights whereby tools were being put in place that would unlock digital content in a way that would ensure that the rights holders would not have access to the value. And some have argued that TPMs just don't work. Look at how much music is circulating for free on the internet and so on. But I think we've already seen today that TPMs are working quite well in the digital movie formats. These are, and we are seeing that Apple iTunes is doing very well. TPMs they don't solve all the issues, but they, at a very minimum, put some speed bumps on the road to unfettered, free distribution of digital works. And I think I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Charles. Thank you for, I think you have only scratched the surface, but I think you were able to sort of compress a lot of material into a very short time, so thank you for that. Just sort of raises the question of all of the legal issues that will be brought up as we legislate, or if we do choose to legislate. You certainly won't have heard the last of it once the legislation gets passed. Issues such as privacy will undoubtedly come up, but issues that we haven't even talked about today, which were raised obliquely this morning, things like antitrust or competition issues, using DRMs to protect markets. One often wonders whether Apple is doing something interesting with DRMs in that way. They're selling iTunes type stuff, but really, is it just about selling iPods and protecting that entire environment? So all sorts of questions. Now we move to our producer at large, and I guess well, hit us with it.
Okay, so God knows where to begin. But I'm going to begin with a reference to a not sufficiently well-recognized culture hero. So let's just read something about him from Wired magazine. Stanford University sophomore David Weekley wants to wipe out the pre-packed CD. Since discovering an extension of a compression technique called MP3, he distributes CD-quality rock and hip-hop over the internet. Weekley's not alone. MP3's impressive 12-to-1 compression ratio has spurred a flood of pirating activity. When Geffen Records told Stanford about Weekley's site, the university shut it down, so Weekley formed Universal Digital Media, LLC. Well, I don't know about that Universal, that could get him in trouble, in hopes of striking a deal to legally distribute tunes. The way he sees it, studios are forestalling the inevitable. Quote, the net renders the need for physical distribution obsolete, unquote, he says. Quote, soon we'll all sell custom digital packages of songs. 2 people raise their hands and tell me when that was written. Nobody knows? It's 11 years ago. So this was Wired magazine 11 years ago. When Terry, you were doing your postdoc at Stanford, Weekley was a sophomore in high school, a junior in high school, and just getting ready to apply to Stanford when you were out at Stanford, you know, and basically by 1996, if anybody had their eyes open, they knew which way the wind was blowing. At the same time, as I like to say, in a few miles up the road from Stanford in Marin County, California, which is I think the single richest or one of the 2 or 3 richest counties in the United States, there were no major record stores present within the territory of the county. And why was that? Because by 96 and 97, all the teenagers that I knew in Marin County had gotten hip to something called Winamp or Macamp. Anybody remember that? All right. And they had discovered it was really not necessary to actually buy music, that they could acquire it for nothing over the internet. How many years into the DMCA were we at that point? Let's say 97. 3 years? 1 year, okay. So the first problem regarding most discussions of the issues being discussed today is that much of the discussion, and apparently most of the discussion for some reason that's obscure to me, has to do with interventions or attempts to contain circumvention of the rules, whether they are technology-imposed rules or legally imposed rules, that prevent the acquisition of music without paying for it, and soon enough, film. Because whatever the situation is now, it's just a function of the lack of bandwidth, and as soon as there's sufficiently cheap bandwidth available everywhere in the universe, which is probably in months, you know, not years, certainly not decades, down the road, then, you know, the film industry will experience exactly the same problems that the music industry is experiencing. Luckily for the film industry, it has multiple revenue events, which is a lot more than the number of revenue events available to the music industry, to the recorded music industry, which is why the recorded music industry is trying to expand the number of revenue events available to them under their newly signed or proposed contracts. But I'd like to think, and there are a lot of lawyers or lawyers to be in the audience, that no lawyer who is operating on behalf of an artist would be stupid enough to allow an artist to sign a contract which gives access to multiple revenue events to the recording company to which the artist is about to be signed, especially if it's a major recording label, because the majors, you know, have almost no ability to actually create a successful artist career any longer. So in the off chance that one of their artists does actually succeed to some great extent, such a contract would entitle the major record company to pieces of the merchandising revenue or the live income revenue or any other forms of revenue that, will appear, and believe me, there will be many. So since the mid-90s, the late mid-90s, the handwriting has been on the wall, and all attempts to prevent the free distribution of all the music ever recorded in the history of the world have been completely and utterly unsuccessful. I'm going to pull up an article from, of all places, USA Today, but it's just a kind of more compressed version of articles that have appeared in the New York Times and in the Wall Street Journal within the last few weeks. And on February 15th, 2007, USA Today says digital sales may be playing a swan song. And the first line is, the online digital music stinks. iTunes, Rhapsody, Zune, Zune particularly, Napster, you name it, they're all failures. The hype is people believing otherwise. Bloggers, tech writers, and your friends know more about computers than you do. Shout that iTunes is the best thing to happen to music since the microphone or maybe psychedelic drugs, but it's just not true. Nearly 6 years after the introduction of iTunes and the iPod, online music has failed to interest the vast majority of the world's music consumers, which is no doubt why Steve Jobs recently called for an end to copy protection software on digital songs. I don't actually believe that's the reason, but ignore that for a second. Something has to change, or iTunes and its ilk will never break into the mass market. Jobs admitted, or maybe it would be better to say that Jobs proclaimed, that iTunes penetration has been weak in his disgust to death essay, Thoughts on Music, posted a couple of weeks ago. Jobs noted that only about 3% of songs on a typical iPod are bought on iTunes. The rest are either ripped from CDs or transferred into iPods, or legitimately downloaded or illegitimately downloaded for free off file sharing sites such as Kazaa or eDonkey. 3% of what's on, the average iPod is derived from the iTunes store. I don't even think Steve Jobs is particularly interested in keeping the iTunes store open any longer. The iTunes store was a promotion mechanism for the iPod. Well, they sold 3.5 million iPods last quarter, so I don't really think, they're lacking for market awareness, of the usefulness of this particular device. He doesn't make any money on this stuff. The royalty, what's the right word? The royalty rules imposed upon Jobs by the recording industry are so draconian that there is no way they can make money off of the sales of iTunes. I know that Steve Jobs' number for what a download should cost is much, 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 much closer to my proposal, for the 5-cent, universal 5-cent download than it is to the 99 cents download, which the music industry imposed upon Jobs in exchange for Jobs getting access to these copyrights. In their infinite wisdom, the music business decided, well, maybe they should go to a multi-tiered pricing model, or better yet, to maybe something in the vicinity of $1.50, for some forms of product, stipulating that, and maybe a little less for other forms of product, and maybe a little less for other forms of product, and Jobs, told them no, he won't do it. And at the end of the day, Jobs is much more powerful than they are, because his iPod empire does not depend upon access to monetized music. And that gets me to one, I think, ill-noticed point. I personally am seeing the music, interested in seeing the music business remonetized, because I actually care about the fate of creators of musical works, which certainly, cuts me off from such, or separates me from such people as Sean Fanning, who didn't give a damn about, the fate of the creators of musical works and their income possibilities. But having said that, one can say that since virtually all the music ever recorded in the history of the world is available for nothing somewhere, and that somewhere can be accessed relatively quickly with really no penalty or operational prohibition against accessing that music, that something very important has been achieved for music, and that is that for the first time in the history of the world, large numbers of citizens, in excess of 1 billion, this week, and that number will continue to go up, will have access to the entirety of the recorded music database. So that access to music has now been universalized. There have been some trade-offs. It's universalized on the back of a particularly bad sounding and information depleted codec, MP3, and it doesn't get the creators paid. But if one defines the greatest social good as infinite access to an infinitude of music for about a quarter of the world's population this week and a lot higher percentage as the weeks go by, then maybe one can say that the confluence of available technology and non-market forces has resulted in a tremendous breakthrough in terms of the greater good, and that breakthrough is the omni-availability of music. Terry referenced the work that we've been doing here at McGill on very, very low-cost distributional mediums, or matrices, of which the 5-cent solution is, one output. And of course, the idea there is that if you make, this all comes from a comment that I made at Canadian Music Week, I think about 3 or 4 years ago, where I said, with a sneer on my face, well, what do you guys on this panel think is the sweet spot for the sale of music on the net? So somebody said, well, 78 cents, 32 cents, 86 cents, all sorts of random numbers. And I said, no, it's anything measurable above 0. So a little bit of market research that we conducted proved that 5 cents is functionally equivalent to 0, as far as most people are concerned. And that would allow, at that price point, something that I call Sandy's Silicon Law of digital access, which basically says that theft of digital objects will cease to occur when access to digital objects is sufficiently cheap that it's not worth the trouble to steal them. And at 5 cents, 5 cents is perceived as a price point that does not require theft, because it's just not worth spending the time necessary to circumvent 5 cent availability, to get the music for free. It's a bad trade-off. There are many more things that I could say, but I'll end it with a comment about DRM and actually TPM as well. This is, except for purposes of tracking a digital object, in the hopes of either giving information to people who should get access to this information, but of course that always raises the question of what does no such agency and its ilk, do with that sort of information that they can also access. But presuming that, that no such agency is not the primary consumer of information that is derived from tracking the path of digital objects, other than for the purposes of tracking the path of digital objects, which may be useful to artists or could be used to pay digital artists some like micropayment for each transaction, I consider all other examples of TPM and DRM to be complete and utter fool's errands. The internet is to a very great extent a creation of the hacker ethos. And even if you don't have to go to measures as extreme as hacking a DRM, there is absolutely no way to lock up these digital objects because, as far as I can see, there is no way to prevent any digital media object from eventually having an analog life form. Once a digital media object is translated into an analog life form, it can be copied no matter what TPM or DRM has been applied to it in its digital life form. It is a complete and utter fool's errand. Hundreds of millions of dollars, probably in excess of $1 billion, has gone down the rat hole in this effort. I, for one, have no explanation for why seemingly intelligent people, intelligent enough to sign checks, still seem to be, prone to this delusion, but, maybe, the person writes his PhD thesis on the sociology of incompetence in the entertainment industry will be able to provide, a sufficient explanation. I, for one, cannot come up with an explanation. I'm glad that it's providing work for lawyers, and people, cannot get hired by no such agency to do work on cryptography or other, seemingly more useful endeavors. But as far as I'm concerned, it really is the classic definition of fool's errancy. So I really have grown bored discussing it, but it seems that there's never-ending market for discussion of this issue, so I will respond out of courtesy to the people in the room.
A fine example of the old adage, always end on a high point.
Yeah.
That's why I wanted to go last.
Rather than have just the panelists who are also eligible to ask questions, if we're going to have this conversation in the age of the internet where you are the person of the year, maybe you've got some questions, comments? It was all very clear. We've settled the issue. Michael.
Just a small point with respect to Charles' comment about our WIPO commitments. We should be very clear about what obligations we took on when signing the WIPO internet treaty. That would be none. At international law, signing the treaty does not obligate a country for any of the underlying provisions. You only are obligated once you ratify it. The proof of that was the United States, along with Somalia, that has signed but not implemented or ratified the Convention on Protection of the Child. And so we do have a choice. We can look to what others have done, but we need not feel that we are obligated to do so.
Charles, a retort or?
Well, what I would say is, yes, I mean, you're absolutely accurate. We're not legally required to do so, but we did sign on to this, and all of our trading partners have ratified, implemented the principles, and we do exist in the world nations, and quite frankly, my point of view is that it's in our public interest, it's in the interest of Canadians to implement this legislation.
Can I?
Absolutely.
From a legislative point of view, the big issue on Parliament Hill is if you talk to any politician, they'll say, well, we haven't ratified WIPO. And I think there's a misconception that DMCA is WIPO, and I think that's a deliberate misconception. I'm not all that impressed with the notion of our nation states who've gone ahead. It's got Botswana, Uzbekistan, Togo. There is a bit of an element of the digital coalition of the willing, I think, in terms of us, how we're being asked to implement. I think the issue in terms of the debate today is there's a market debate. DRMs and TPMs, as Sandy said, that's the market has moved, and it's moving so much faster than politicians. We're at least 10 years behind. So whatever we do, I believe there's an element of cultural or practical irrelevancy. However, there is an issue of, in terms of WIPO, if it comes before us in a legislative capacity, in any new copyright legislation, there's going to be the issue of legal protection for DRMs and TPMs. And I certainly believe, as legislators, of course, we're going to have to say, if you want to put a technically protective lock on your product, of course you have the right to do that. From a legislative point of view, that's something that we would have to put in there. The two issues in WIPO that I think I would be very serious about looking at if it came before a legislative review committee are the key elements of the adequate legal protection and the adequate legal remedies, because it seems to be a blank check. I think in light of what we've seen, we have to insist that there's adequate consumer protection if we're going to give the legal protection. And in terms of legal remedies, I personally feel, and I would fight like hell in a legislative committee to ensure that we have clearly defining what the damages would be in terms of various scenarios. Because the industry hates when you bring up the fact that they sue 12-year-olds, but they do. And I don't want to have any legislation that treats a 10-year-old the same as an international pirating organization. So we have the right and the obligation as parliamentarians to strike an appropriate balance. So that would be an appropriate balance. Consumer protection measures, I think we'd have to spell them out fairly clear. If you are going to put these digital locks on your product, we don't want an issue like Sony. We don't want to have a consumer have to wait 2 or 3 years to get protection from that. There's got to be very clear legislative issues in terms of consumer protection. But in terms of a legislative framework, of course, people can put a digital lock on their product. They have the right to do that. And certain people will circumvent it. That's going to be the market debate.
If I could just maybe add a comment. There's in the there's a kind of a good line, I think, in Al Gore's film on global warming, that it's important not to move from a situation of denial directly to a situation of despair without stopping in the middle and taking action. And it seems to me that we move very rapidly in the digital copyright debate to just throwing up our hands. Look at everybody. It's so easy. There's nothing we can do. Let's just give into it in a kind of fatalistic way. And I don't think that's the approach that we've adopted, for instance, in other realms of trading, in the other realms of the e-commerce debate, for instance, with respect to privacy. We noticed that all of a sudden it was possible to do data profiling on hundreds of thousands, millions of people in a very easy way, much easier than we've ever done it before. And all that information existed already. We could have just sort of thrown up our hands and said, these major companies, these data marketers, these direct marketers, they already know everything about me anyway. Why legislate? Why do anything? And I think you have to. We didn't do that. We put in place privacy laws to protect against the most egregious abuses that are the flip side of the wonderful potential of the digital world that we live in. And in my mind, you have to do creatively the same thing for the digital rights space. Yeah, there's a lot of digital material that's already out there. The entire catalog of Sony whatever is already out there. But moving from there's a problem to it's too late to solve it, no, I think you have to stop and say, what is the most egregious downside of this wonderful point that you've made, which is we have this terrific access now, much better than we had before, to all this wonderful content. Well, the downside that needs to be addressed is that those who have made this incredible investment in creating digital works are not being properly rewarded. A film studio will spend $200 million to make a film, and I can buy it or see it for $10. If it's $0 instead of $10, there's a problem. So in that sense, I think it's important to look at this as we have to do something to correct the problem, and it is a real problem.
Fred?
I think there's a shared element here. I think if we could take sort of the copyright bargain seriously and give creators of works, whether before they see their rights to copyright owners or otherwise, if we're going to give them a real chance of getting compensated for the work that they're doing, I think that is a common element here. The discussion is really just about needs. Then it varies. We're going to make it practically impossible for these works to be traded for free with VPNs. I think it's very hard to argue for that. The other approach I think is to make it illegal, and then I think the Sandy's approach is to make it just irrelevant, because you're saying when the trouble that you're going to go through to actually go out and get this stuff for free, not even worth what you're going to pay for it in monetary terms, then and you're just making that irrelevant, and you're competing sort of on the same playing field as the free services out there. But my question is, Sandy, is it possible to make it truly irrelevant, absent some kind of legal enforcement measure to make sure that those free services are at the very least penalized to the point that the incentives are very high for something like the price distribution or another system like no end?
You certainly could, within the sphere of something like the 5-cent solution, provide music and film soon enough in all codecs known to man. You could re-encode the entire database in new developing codecs. You could re-encode the known database of music, at least in codecs that can actually transmit information on a analog basis within a digital wrapper. So it was tremendously enhanced potential bandwidth so that works would sound infinitely better than they do on the MP3 format. I mean, there are all sorts of things you can do to add, lots of extra value. I think that so that, it would seem, if the price was sufficiently low, a better deal to just pay for something that was easily accessible, that you knew what you were buying, that the quality choices, the available quality choices spanned all the spectrum. So if you wanted data economy for your puny little hard drive, you could have it, or if you had a monstrous hard drive and you didn't care about data economy, then you could buy something that chews up a lot more data, which next week will actually chew up a lot less data than it does this week anyway. I mean, yeah, so I think you could, there are certainly incentives that could be offered to remonetize the business if the price is sufficiently low. There certainly is also a kind of like hacker aesthetic out there, if that's the right word, or hacker ethos, better term, that says, well, I'm going to grab everything that I can grab, even if it costs almost nothing. But there are real disincentives to doing that for most people who aren't there to prove a point. They just want access to, they just want access to media. And if the media is sufficiently cheap, then they'll probably access it, if it, on some basis it costs them close to nothing per year rather than absolutely nothing per year, because they'll actually be able to get the works and the versions they think they're getting, to be able to get them in all codecs known to man and as yet unknown to man, which are actually being researched and developed but aren't yet available. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that if the price is sufficiently low and the choice of delivery media mechanisms is sufficiently wide, and if all the stuff of at least analog origin is re-encoded at the highest available data rates or as an analog object within a digital delivery system, digital delivery mechanism, or if any number of those things are done, then, and the price is sufficiently low, say 5 cents a pop, then you probably could remonetize most of this business. And, the estimates that we've done on this show that it's pretty easy to at least equal or in fact surpass by some small margin the entire, royalty flow, the royalty flows of the legal, music business as it now exists. That's a pretty easy thing to do if you convert some large proportion of the current demonetized traffic to monetized traffic. You don't even have to convert it all. The estimates for the amount of demonetized traffic, depending on who you believe, vary from, I think, somewhere in the high 30s at the low end, billion transactions per year to, around 125, 130 billion demonetized transactions. At the high end, it just depends. I know it sounds like a joke on what sampling methodology you're using and how you analyze the shape of the data flows of online traffic. But having said that, whether it's 30 or 50 or 100 or 150 billion, just picking a very plausible number, say 50 billion demonetized downloads this year, which is a number that a lot of people agree on as at least being plausible. If you went to something like a 5-cent solution, then you generate incomes that exceeds the current royalty flows that are paid out, by the mainstream music industry by the currently existing mainstream music industry to all the copyright holders. So it's a desirable thing to do, and it's not an implausible thing to do. And it would certainly, one great service that it would immediately supply would be supplying at least the original recordings done on an analog basis within a delivery mechanism, a codec that actually does a lot more justice to these recordings than MP3 does, which radically impoverishes the quality of the music it delivers. And the important thing to realize when we speak about radical impoverishment of the quality of the music as it's delivered by MP3, the predominant delivery mechanism, is that it devalues music, not only as a monetary object, but it really reduces the impacts of music, because MP3 strips away a lot of the critical ineffabilities that are very important to the music appreciation experience. So if we could migrate everything to higher quality codecs, or even an analog delivery, even analog wrapped within some sort of digital delivery mechanism, that would be a great service to music and would help to revalue or raise the value, the perceived value of music on the part of the audience, because right now the perceived value of music is zero, for most people, because virtually all the music being consumed in the world today is being consumed.
I know we're running a bit over time. I'll take one more comment, and I know who I'm going to take it from because I saw her hand up there earlier. But I can tell you all of the lawyers in the audience are right now cringing at how difficult changing to such a radicalized solution would be. And that should be a question, I think, that comes up in this afternoon's discussion. How do you get to there from here? A very interesting topic. Isolde Gendreau, who's a professor at the University of Montreal and teaches in the IP area. I saw your hand up earlier. And I know Isolde and I both served as drafting advisors to the Justice Department on Bill C-60, which failed, not because of anything we said, of course. But did you have a comment or a question earlier? I thought I saw your hand up.
Well, I think probably my comment would be more for this afternoon, but I'm wondering about the actual implementation of this model. And I'm wondering why this search for a low-cost solution, which sounds very promising, is not being done through the existing collecting societies.
Well, why don't we save that then, because there are all sorts of conspiracy theories that can go through the lunch break, and I'm sure they'll be proffered. Quick answer?
Quickly, because I think with Sandy's model, the biggest threat right now is if you're Mariah Carey, or if you're Hollywood. There is a big threat out there because people don't see a value that, quite frankly, if it's coming from the majors. What's happened in Canada, and I think this is the stunning success of the Canadian Musician Creators Coalition, of almost every band, at least in English Canada, signed on immediately, is that they're seeing that on the internet there's a relationship between the kids or the adults who are downloading and actually purchasing product. An example would be the British band Arctic Monkeys, the biggest selling #1 first album in British history. My kids heard about them on a blog site. They downloaded the song that day, probably illegally. They didn't tell their old man. But they were up on iTunes almost immediately. They bought the whole catalog, I think twice, off iTunes, judging from the bill.
Did you like severely chastise
Then they went and bought the
so much
CD,
money?
and then the old man bought the CD. Now they're looking for the vinyl because they tell me that Dad, CD is crap, we throw CDs out. So now they're going to spend $30 on the vinyl. And so that's where there is, I think, the success of smaller niche markets is suddenly very, very strong, and there will be a huge market potential for Canadian film if we aren't afraid to get in there, because Canadians are going to want to see those obscure films going down the road. Where the heck can you see going down the road? If you can get it on the internet, if you can pay for it. That's why we need to move to a monetizing discussion. Of course, this discussion is not going to happen. We need to get to that monetizing discussion very quickly. Otherwise, we are going to be swamped on the television front, and Hollywood is certainly going to be swamped when the bandwidth gets a little higher. And we don't have a response to that. And I think the problem is if we just look to DRM, we're still going to be running after the horse long after it's out of the gate.
I want to thank the panel for providing a lot of hooks for, I think, what will be an interesting discussion this afternoon. And I think Don's going to say a few words about lunch.
Yeah, I feel a little like the Grim Reaper here, Sandy, but the conversation's just picking up. But I do bring lunch, so it's a little better.
McCarthy brings lunch.
Yes, McCarthy brings lunch. Thank you, Charles. He just beat me to the punch, that's all. However, you won't get lunch as provided by McCarthy unless you go to the right location, which means that we now move to the Faculty of Law. Most of you, I think, know where it is, but it's 3644 Peel Street. You can get there from a variety of means. It's easily got by a taxi. It's just north of Dr. Penfield Avenue on Peel. And lunchroom 16, the room is 16 where the lunch will be served. For those of you who are unfamiliar with location, it's about 6 blocks that way, or you can take the hypotenuse through the campus and arrive that way. There's many people will be moving in that direction, and just find your way there as soon as you can, please, so that we will have time for this discussion this afternoon. And thanks to McCarthy, yes. See you there. Millisecond. Thanks.